Sometimes life gives you everything you think you want, then takes it all away in a single heartbeat. Tom Callahan learned this the hard way when cancer stole his wife, leaving him alone to raise his 8-year-old daughter on a mechanic's wages. Then his estranged father died, and Tom inherited the old man's ranch in Wyoming. Everyone in town laughed at him. They called the place worthless dirt and said Tom was a fool for leaving his steady job. His little girl Emma needed stability, not some broken-down farm that hadn't made money in decades, but Tom had nowhere else to go. While cleaning out the old barn, his shovel hit something metal buried in the ground. He dug deeper and found a hidden room filled with gold bars worth $50 million. Why had his father kept this secret his whole life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Denver fog clung to Tom Callahan's windshield as he drove through the industrial district toward Murphy's Auto Repair for what would be his final day. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old pickup truck, the same hands that had rebuilt countless engines and held his dying wife during her last moments 3 years ago. In the passenger seat, a stack of unopened letters bore his father's careful handwriting correspondence that had arrived monthly for over a decade, each envelope returned to sender unopened. Tom had built a good life in Denver, not glamorous, but steady, honest work that paid the bills and kept food on the table for Emma. He'd started at Murphy's right out of high school, working his way up from oil changes to head mechanic. Old Murphy treated him fair, gave him time off when Sarah got sick, and never once complained when Tom brought Emma to the shop on school holidays. The shop smelled of motor oil and coffee when Tom walked in that February morning. Murphy looked up from the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about this, Tommy?" Murphy asked, using the name he'd called him for 20 years. "That ranch ain't worth the dirt it sits on." Your old man, God rest his soul, he wasn't exactly known for his business sense. Tom pulled off his work coveralls for the last time, hanging them on the peg where they'd lived for 2 decades. "I don't have much choice, Murphy. The rent's going up again, and Emma needs more than I can give her here. What's she think about all this?" Tom's face softened at the mention of his daughter, Emma Rose Callahan, 8 years old with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. She'd taken the news better than he'd expected, probably because she trusted him completely, a trust that terrified him more than any financial uncertainty. "She thinks it's an adventure," Tom said. "Keeps asking if there'll be horses." Murphy chuckled despite himself. "Well, there might be. Probably dead ones, but horses nonetheless." He pulled an envelope from the cash register. "Your final check, plus a little extra. You ever change your mind, you got a job waiting here." Tom shook the old man's hand, feeling the weight of leaving behind the only stability he'd known since Sarah died. Outside, Denver hummed with its usual morning energy. People hurried to jobs they'd wake up to tomorrow. Secure in routines, Tom was about to abandon for a gamble on land he'd never seen. The apartment felt hollow as Tom packed their belongings into boxes. Not much to show for 32 years of living clothes, books, Emma's drawings covering every surface of the refrigerator, and Sarah's things he couldn't bring himself to sort through. The wedding photos still lined the mantel, Sarah's smile frozen in happier times when the future seemed certain and cancer was just a word in medical textbooks. Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully placing her stuffed animals into a cardboard box. She'd inherited her mother's organizational skills, making neat piles of books and toys with the seriousness of a much older child. "Dad, tell me about Grandpa again," she said without looking up. Tom leaned against the door frame. He told her what little he knew, that Daniel Callahan owned a ranch in Wyoming, that they'd had some kind of falling out years ago, and that the man had died alone with no one but a lawyer at his funeral. The truth was more complicated. Daniel had left when Tom was 17, choosing a bottle over his family, and Tom had spent 15 years angry about it. "He was your grandmother's husband," Tom said carefully. "He lived on a ranch called Broken Arrow, out in Wyoming where the sky goes on forever." "Was he mean?" The question caught Tom off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart. I thought he was, but maybe I was wrong about a lot of things." Emma looked up with those serious green eyes. "Mama used to say people aren't always what they seem on the outside." Sarah's wisdom, spoken through their daughter's voice. Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Emma said something that reminded him how much Sarah lived on in her. The lawyer's office in downtown Denver felt like foreign territory. Harrison Associates specialized in estate planning for people with more money than Tom had ever imagined. The secretary's shoes probably cost more than his truck payment, but Daniel Callahan, drunk or not, had retained the services of James Harrison III to handle his final affairs. Harrison was younger than Tom expected, maybe 40, with the kind of clean-shaven confidence that came from never having to choose between groceries and rent. He spread documents across his mahogany desk with practiced efficiency. "Your father's estate is relatively straightforward, Mr. Callahan," Harrison said. "The ranch consists of approximately 800 acres in Sweetwater County, Wyoming. Mineral rights included. There's an existing mortgage with First National of Rock Springs, currently about 18 months behind." Tom studied the survey maps and property photographs. The house looked like it hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration. Outbuildings leaned at angles that defied physics. Broken fence posts stretched toward mountains that looked impossibly distant. "What's it worth?" Tom asked. Harrison's pause said everything. "The land has potential, good water rights, decent soil for grazing, but it would need considerable investment to become operational." "How considerable?" "More than most people have, Mr. Callahan. I'll be honest. 3 other potential heirs declined the inheritance once they saw the financial obligations." Tom stared at the photographs. This was his inheritance debt and desolation wrapped in legal documents. But it was also 800 acres of possibility, and more importantly, it was somewhere Emma could grow up without him worrying about rent increases and neighborhood safety. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your father left specific instructions that you were to receive this only if you decided to keep the property." Tom recognized the handwriting, the same careful script from all those unopened letters. His name was written across the front in fading ink, and something rattled inside when he picked it up. "What if I decide not to keep it?" "Then it gets returned to me, unopened, and the property goes to auction." Tom slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket without opening it. Some decisions required the right moment, and a lawyer's office didn't feel like the place to read his father's final words. The drive back to the apartment gave him time to think. 800 acres, mineral rights, a mortgage that was underwater but manageable if he could find work. Emma deserved better than a cramped apartment where she had to whisper after 9 o'clock so the neighbors wouldn't complain. That evening, Tom spread the ranch photographs across their small kitchen table while Emma did homework. She studied the pictures with the intense focus she brought to everything, tracing the fence lines with her finger. "It looks lonely," she said finally. "Yeah, it does. But not scary lonely, more like waiting lonely, like it's waiting for us to make it better." Tom looked at his daughter, really looked at her. 8 years old, and she could see hope in a photograph that looked like failure to everyone else. Maybe that was Sarah's gift living on, or maybe Emma just had the kind of optimism that hadn't been beaten down by years of compromising dreams. "What do you think, Em? Should we take a chance on Grandpa's ranch?" Emma picked up the photograph of the house, studying it with serious consideration. "Mama always said home isn't a place, it's the people you love. As long as we're together, we can make anywhere home." Tom felt Sarah's presence in those words, her voice echoing through their daughter's wisdom. Maybe Daniel Callahan had made mistakes, maybe the ranch was a financial disaster, but it was also a chance. A chance to give Emma something more than rented walls and neighbors who complained about children laughing. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom finally opened his father's envelope. Inside was a small brass key and a note written in that familiar, careful script. "Tommy, if you're reading this, you decided to take a chance on the old place. Good. It's got more potential than it looks, and you've got more of me in you than either of us wanted to admit." The key opens the desk in my bedroom. Inside you'll find things that might help you understand why I left and why I stayed away. I wasn't much of a father, but I tried to be a good guardian of something important. Take care of Emma. She deserves the childhood I couldn't give you. Daniel. Tom held the key up to the lamplight, feeling its weight in his palm. His father's final mystery, waiting in a desk 800 miles away. Whatever Daniel Callahan had been protecting all these years, Tom was about to inherit it, along with 800 acres of possibility and debt. 2 weeks later, Tom loaded everything they owned into a rented trailer and pointed his truck toward Wyoming. In the passenger seat, Emma clutched a road atlas, tracking their progress with the excitement of a child who saw adventure where adults saw uncertainty. In his pocket, Daniel's brass key waited alongside the questions Tom had carried for 15 years. The last thing he saw in his rearview mirror was the Denver skyline fading into morning haze. Ahead lay mountains, open sky, and a ranch that might destroy them or save them. Tom couldn't tell which yet, but for the first time since Sarah died, he felt like they were driving towards something instead of just running away. The Wyoming wind hit Tom's face like a slap when he stepped out of the truck at Broken Arrow Ranch. 8 hours of driving through increasingly empty landscape had brought them to this collection of weathered buildings scattered across rolling prairie like dice thrown by a careless hand. The house squatted under the enormous sky, its grey siding bleached by decades of sun and storm. Emma climbed down from the passenger seat, her sneakers crunching on gravel mixed with tumbleweeds. She stood perfectly still for a moment, absorbing the silence that stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken fence wire. "It's so quiet," she said, wonder replacing the excitement that had carried her through Colorado. Tom pulled the original deed and survey maps from his jacket, documents the lawyer had insisted he bring. The papers felt substantial in his hands, heavy with legal language that made 800 acres of prairie his responsibility. According to the survey, the property stretched further than the eye could see, encompassing not just the buildings but grazing land that rolled toward distant mountains. "Daddy, look." Emma pointed toward the house where a woman emerged from the front door. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. She approached them with the measured pace of someone comfortable with wide spaces and long silences. "You must be Tom," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Martha Hayes. I run the Historical Society in town, and I knew your father." Tom shook her hand, surprised by her firm grip. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Your father asked me to keep an eye on the place. I've been doing basic maintenance, making sure the pipes didn't freeze." Martha's eyes moved to Emma, who had wandered toward a broken porch swing. "You must be Emma. Your grandfather talked about you." Emma looked up sharply. "He did?" "He had pictures," Martha said gently. "School photos your father sent, though I don't think Tom knew Daniel kept them." Tom felt something shift in his chest. His father had kept Emma's pictures. All those years of silence, and Daniel had been following his granddaughter's life from a distance. "I should warn you," Martha continued, "the town's been talking since word got out about the inheritance. Not all of it friendly." As if summoned by her words, a dust cloud appeared on the dirt road leading to the ranch. A newer pickup truck approached, pulling up beside Tom's vehicle. The man who emerged was maybe 50, wearing pressed jeans and a spotless cowboy hat that had never seen actual ranch work. "You must be Callahan," the man said, not offering his hand. "Jake Morrison. I own the spread next door." He gestured toward a pristine ranch house visible in the distance. "I'll cut right to the chase. I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for this place. Cash deal, quick closing." Tom studied Morrison's face, noting the practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just got here, and you can see what you're dealing with. This place has been bleeding money for 20 years. Your old man couldn't make it work, and he actually knew something about ranching." Morrison's gaze swept the broken buildings with theatrical dismay. "No offense, but you're a city mechanic with a little girl to support. This land will eat you alive." Emma had drifted closer during the conversation, her small hand finding Tom's. She studied Morrison with the intense focus she brought to homework problems. "What's fair market value?" Tom asked. Morrison's smile widened. 80,000, more than generous, considering the debt and condition. Martha Hayes made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Morrison's eyes flicked toward her with obvious irritation. "That's less than $100 an acre," Martha said quietly. "For land that can't support cattle and buildings that should be condemned," Morrison replied. His tone remained friendly, but something harder emerged underneath. "Look, Callahan, I'm doing you a favor. Take the money and go back to Denver before you lose everything." Tom felt Emma's hand tighten in his. She was watching Morrison with the wariness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for her own protection. "I appreciate the offer," Tom said, "but I think I'll look around first." Morrison's smile finally faltered. "Your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you." He climbed back into his truck, pausing before he closed the door. "This country doesn't forgive mistakes, Callahan, especially ones made by outsiders." The dust from Morrison's departure settled slowly in the still air. Martha watched the truck disappear with visible relief. "Jake Morrison's been trying to buy this land for years," she said. "Your father refused every offer." "Why?" Martha hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Daniel was complicated. The town remembers him as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart, but there was more to him than that. He had his reasons for staying, even when staying was hard." Tom pulled out the brass key his father had left him. He mentioned a desk in his bedroom. "I'll show you," Martha said. The inside of the house smelled like dust and loneliness. Sheets covered most of the furniture, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece pictures Tom didn't remember posing for, images of Emma at various ages, even a wedding photo of Tom and Sarah that he didn't know his father possessed. Daniel's bedroom was spartanly furnished. A single bed with military precision corners, a dresser with nothing on top, and an old oak desk positioned near the window. The brass key fit perfectly into the center drawer. Inside, Tom found more photographs, but these were different. Black and white images of Daniel in military uniform, standing beside men in suits near what looked like a government facility. Official documents with letterheads Tom didn't recognize, and beneath it all, a leather journal filled with his father's careful handwriting. Emma climbed onto the bed, studying a photograph of Daniel in uniform. "Grandpa was a soldier?" "Looks like it," Tom said, flipping through the journal. The entries were brief, often cryptic, but they painted a picture of a man involved in something significant during the Cold War years. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Your father served in the military before you were born. He didn't talk about it much." Tom read a journal entry dated 1963. "Package secured as ordered. Morrison Sr. confirmed coordinates. Operation Cornerstone proceeding as scheduled." "Martha," Tom said slowly, "what do you know about Operation Cornerstone?" Her face went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's in my father's journal, along with the name Morrison." Martha sat heavily in the room's single chair. "I think we need to have a longer conversation about your father, Tom, but not here and not now." Through the bedroom window, Tom could see Emma exploring the barn, her small figure dwarfed by the massive structure. The building leaned significantly to one side, its red paint long since faded to rust brown. "The barn's not safe," Martha said, following his gaze. "Daniel always meant to tear it down." But Emma was already inside, her voice echoing in the empty space. Tom hurried outside, Martha following. "Emma, come out of there." "Dad, look at this." Emma's voice carried excitement instead of fear. Tom found her in the back corner of the barn, kneeling beside what looked like a patch of disturbed earth. The dirt was a different color here, darker and more compact than the surrounding area. "Something's buried here," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. "The ground feels different." Tom knelt beside his daughter, pressing his hands against the earth. She was right. The soil had been disturbed, filled in, and settled over time. It formed a rough rectangle about 6 feet by 4 feet. Martha approached cautiously. Daniel spent a lot of time in this barn, especially the last few years. I always assumed he was drinking, but he never let anyone inside. Tom looked at the journal in his hands, then at the disturbed earth beneath the barn. His father's final letter had promised answers, but it seemed Daniel Callahan had left behind more questions than solutions. "Emma," Tom said quietly, "I think we're going to need a shovel." Tom found a rusty shovel propped against the barn wall, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. As he began to dig where Emma had indicated, the blade struck something solid within inches of the surface. Not wood or stone, something metallic that rang with hollow authority. "What is it, Daddy?" Emma asked, crouching beside the growing hole. Martha Hayes moved closer, her face tense with curiosity and something that looked like concern. "Daniel always said this barn had good bones. I never understood what he meant." Tom cleared more dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a steel hatch. A military compass lay beside it in the earth, its brass surface tarnished, but intact. Engraved around the rim were coordinates that Tom didn't recognize, numbers that seemed to reference a location far from Wyoming. "That's his compass," Martha said softly. "Daniel carried it everywhere during his last years. I thought it was just sentiment." Tom picked up the compass, feeling its weight in his palm. The needle pointed true north, but the engraved coordinates puzzled him. They didn't match any local landmarks he could think of, and the precision suggested they marked something specific and important. "We should probably stop here for today," Martha said, glancing toward the road. "People talk in small towns, and Jake Morrison has friends." Tom reluctantly agreed, covering the hatch with an old tarp, and Emma's promise to keep their discovery secret. That evening, he enrolled Emma in Sweetwater Elementary while she explored the ranch house, her child's adaptability already turning the strange into familiar. The school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind but direct. "Emma will do fine academically," she said after reviewing Emma's Denver records. "But small towns can be hard on outsiders, especially when there's family history involved." "What kind of history?" "Your father had a reputation, Mr. Callahan. Fair or not, some of that might follow Emma until people get to know her." Tom watched Emma through the office window as she played alone on the playground, her natural friendliness meeting with cautious responses from the other children. It broke his heart to see her experiencing the same rejection he'd felt as a teenager whenever his father's drinking became town gossip. The next morning brought Jake Morrison to their front door again, this time with a man Tom didn't recognize. Expensive suit, city haircut, the kind of smooth confidence that came with serious money. "Tom Callahan? I'm Richard Sterling, Morrison Development. I understand Jake made you an offer on this property." Tom stepped onto the porch, leaving Emma inside with her cereal. "He did. I'm prepared to double it. 160,000. Cash, quick closing." Sterling's smile was practiced perfection. "I represent investors interested in developing this area. Ranch land, recreational opportunities, that sort of thing." The offer was more money than Tom had ever imagined, having enough to set Emma up for college and give them both security. But something in Sterling's eagerness reminded him of Morrison's press-too-hard friendliness. "That's generous," Tom said carefully, "but I'm not ready to sell." Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Callahan, I've done my research on this property. The debt load alone makes it a poor investment, and you have a young daughter to consider. Take the money and start fresh somewhere with better opportunities." "I appreciate the concern about my daughter," Tom replied, his voice cooling, "but we're staying." After they left, Tom found himself studying his father's military compass again. The engraved coordinates nagged at him. Why would Daniel carry coordinates for a place that didn't seem to exist locally? And why had Morrison's father's name appeared in Daniel's Cold War journal? That afternoon, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table, Tom attempted basic repairs on the ranch house. The plumbing worked but groaned with age. The electrical system was a decade past replacement, and every window needed new putty and paint. But the structure was solid good bones, as Martha had said about the barn. Emma looked up from her math problems. "Dad, why don't people like us here?" The question hit Tom harder than he'd expected. It's not that they don't like us, sweetheart. They just don't know us yet. But they knew Grandpa, and they didn't like him either. Tom sat beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people make up their minds about someone based on stories they've heard. It takes time to show them who you really are. Was Grandpa really a bad person? Tom looked at the compass sitting on the table, then at the photographs of Daniel in military uniform. I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe we all were. That evening, Martha Hayes returned with a casserole and information. She'd been researching Daniel's military service, calling in favors with historian friends and government contacts. Your father's records are mostly classified, she said as they sat at the kitchen table. But I found references to Operation Cornerstone. It was a Cold War program, something about securing strategic assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tom showed her the compass coordinates. Any idea what these reference? Martha studied the numbers, frowning. They're not local, that's certain, but they're too precise to be random. She paused, meeting his eyes. Tom, I think your father was involved in something much bigger than anyone realized, and I think Jake Morrison's family knows what it was. What makes you say that? Because Jake's grandfather, Samuel Morrison, owned the land adjacent to this ranch during the 1960s. According to county records, he sold a significant portion to the government in 1962, then bought it back 2 years later for a fraction of the price. Tom felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together. What kind of government sale? The kind that doesn't show up in normal property records. The kind that gets buried in classified files and forgotten histories. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat on the porch steps with his father's compass, watching stars emerge in the Wyoming darkness. The silence was complete except for wind through grass and the distant call of a coyote. In Denver, such quiet would have felt empty, but here it felt full of possibilities and secrets. The compass needle held steady, pointing north toward mountains, invisible in the darkness. But Tom found himself wondering what lay at those engraved coordinates and why his father had carried the location with him until the day he died. Inside the house, Emma slept peacefully in her new bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings and dreams of horses. She'd adapted to the ranch with the resilience of childhood, finding magic where adults saw only challenges. Tom made a decision under the star-filled sky. Whatever his father had protected all these years, whatever secret lay buried beneath the barn, he would uncover the truth. Not just for Emma's inheritance, but for Daniel's memory and the questions that had haunted their family for too long. Tomorrow, he would return to the barn and discover what Daniel Callahan had been guarding in his years of apparent defeat. Emma discovered the radio equipment on a rainy Saturday morning while Tom replaced rotted floorboards in the kitchen. Her excited voice echoed from the farmhouse attic, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across wooden planks. "Dad, you need to see this." Tom climbed the narrow stairs to find Emma surrounded by Cold War-era radio equipment, massive vacuum tube receivers, transmitters with military designation numbers, and coils of wire that suggested serious communication capability. Everything was meticulously maintained, protected by canvas covers and positioned as if Daniel had been using it recently. "It still works," Emma said, pointing to green lights glowing on several units. "I think Grandpa was talking to people." Tom examined the equipment with growing amazement. This wasn't surplus store. Junk. These were professional military radios that would have cost more than most people's annual salary. One unit bore a brass plate reading "Property of U.S. Army Signal Corps," while another had been modified with civilian components in ways that suggested serious expertise. "Emma, don't touch anything else," Tom said, but his daughter had already discovered a logbook beside the main receiver. The entries were in Daniel's handwriting, dating back 15 years. Most were brief notations of times and frequencies, but some included cryptic messages. "Package status confirmed. Asset location secure. Waiting for extraction authorization." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's temperature. His father hadn't been the isolated drunk the town remembered. He'd been maintaining contact with someone, reporting on something, for years after whatever operation had originally brought him to Wyoming. A frequency scanner sat beside the main radio, its display cycling through local emergency channels. Tom realized Daniel had been monitoring all official communications in the county police, fire, emergency services. He'd known everything happening in the area, probably including every visitor to the Broken Arrow Ranch. That afternoon, while Emma played in the house, Tom worked alone in the barn, carefully excavating around the steel hatch. The opening was larger than he'd initially thought, and older. Military hardware, this substantial, wasn't buried overnight. This had been a major construction project disguised as ranch work. Martha Hayes arrived as Tom uncovered the full outline of what appeared to be an entrance to an underground facility. Her face went pale when she saw the extent of the excavation. "Tom, this is bigger than we thought," she said. "You need to understand, during the Cold War, the government built secret installations all over the western states. Missile silos, communication bunkers, storage facilities for things they couldn't keep in Washington." "Storage for what?" "Classified materials. Documents too sensitive for normal archives. Gold reserves moved out of Fort Knox during the Cuban Missile Crisis." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Things that needed to disappear if the Soviets ever invaded." Tom studied the hatch mechanism. It was sophisticated beyond anything a rancher would need, with multiple locking systems and what looked like a hermetic seal. This had been built to protect something valuable from both human intrusion and nuclear fallout. Why would they trust my father with something like this? Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe Daniel stumbled onto it accidentally, or maybe he was recruited because he already lived here. Martha paused, studying the disturbed earth. Or maybe he volunteered for something that required a man willing to sacrifice his reputation to maintain a cover story. The pieces of Daniel's life began forming a different picture. The drinking that drove away his family might have been performance, a way to ensure no one looked too closely at his activities. The isolation that seemed like failure might have been discipline, the lonely vigil of a man protecting secrets too dangerous to share. That evening, Tom attempted to operate the attic radio equipment, following procedures outlined in Daniel's logbook. Most frequencies produced only static, but on one specific channel, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices discussing the Broken Arrow Ranch by name. "Callahan's been digging around the barn. Morrison says the son doesn't know anything. Can't take chances with this much at stake." Tom killed the radio and sat in the darkness, his heart racing. Someone was watching the ranch, monitoring his activities, discussing him as if he were a problem to be solved. The paranoia Daniel had lived with for decades suddenly seemed completely rational. Downstairs, Emma worked on a school report about Wyoming history, using books Martha had brought from the library. Her teacher, Mrs. Quoten Rodriguez, had been encouraging, but Emma's classmates remained distant. The town's judgment of Daniel Callahan extended to his granddaughter, 8-year-old prejudice learned from adult conversations. "Dad," Emma said when Tom joined her at the kitchen table, "Mrs. Hayes brought me a book about the Cold War. Did you know the government built secret places all over Wyoming?" Tom forced his voice to remain casual. "Is that right? They hid important things in case of nuclear war, money and documents and stuff like that." Emma looked up from her book with serious green eyes. Maybe Grandpa was helping protect something important. Children's intuition often cut through adult complications with startling accuracy. Emma had spent less than a week at the ranch and already understood something the town had missed for decades. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom returned to the barn with a stronger flashlight and proper excavation tools. The hatch wouldn't budge, despite his best efforts. It required either a key he didn't have or knowledge of a combination that had died with Daniel. But around the edges of the steel frame, Tom found evidence that confirmed his growing suspicions. Concrete poured with government precision, drainage systems that suggested professional construction, and ventilation pipes that indicated something substantial lay beneath the ranch. His father hadn't inherited a failing ranch and drunk himself into isolation. Daniel Callahan had been a guardian, standing watch over something valuable enough to justify a lifetime of sacrifice. The town's mockery, his family's abandonment, the slow deterioration of his public reputational, acceptable losses to maintain a cover story that kept secret government assets safe. Tom sat in the darkness of the barn, surrounded by evidence of his father's hidden heroism. Daniel had let his son believe the worst about him, rather than risk exposing the truth. He died alone and scorned, taking his secrets to the grave to protect something larger than his personal happiness. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Tom's shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. But Emma deserved to know. Her grandfather had been a man of honor, even if that honor had cost him everything that usually made life worth living. Tomorrow, Tom would find a way to open that hatch and discover what Daniel Callahan had protected with his life's work. Whatever lay beneath the barn was part of Emma's inheritance now, and Tom intended to understand the full scope of what his father had left behind. Tom found Daniel's coded journal while searching through the desk drawers more thoroughly, hidden behind a false back panel that revealed itself only when he pressed against the wood in frustration. The leather-bound book was filled with entries written in a cipher that transformed ordinary letters into meaningless symbols, but the dates told a story of decades-long vigilance. Martha Hayes arrived that Tuesday morning with coffee and the determined expression of someone who'd made a decision overnight. She studied the coded journal with the focused attention of a historian accustomed to puzzles. "This isn't random," she said, tracing the symbols with her finger. "There's a pattern here, a substitution cipher of some kind." During the Cold War, field agents often used book codeciphers based on specific published texts. Tom showed her the radio logs from the attic. He was definitely communicating with someone regularly. "Look at these frequency notations. They're too organized to be random." "Your father was methodical about everything," Martha agreed. "If he created a code, he'd have left himself a way to remember it." They spent the morning examining every book in Daniel's sparse collection, looking for marginalia or markings that might indicate a key text. Emma helped after school, her young eyes catching details the adults missed. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, holding up a worn copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Throughout the book, Daniel had underlined seemingly random letters, but when viewed together, they formed the beginning of a substitution key. Martha's excitement was palpable. He used literature as his cipher base, classic American novels that would be common enough not to draw attention, but specific enough to create a reliable code. Working together, they began decoding the journal entries. The earliest dates back to 1962, describing something called Package Alpha being relocated from primary site to secondary containment. Later entries referenced regular security checks, communication protocols, and increasingly urgent concerns about unauthorized interest from local assets. "Local assets?" Tom asked. Martha's expression darkened. "That could mean anyone, townspeople, neighboring ranchers, local officials, people who might have figured out something unusual was happening on your father's property." One decoded entry from 1987 sent chills through the room. Morrison Sr. made direct inquiry about eastern pasture activities. Cover story holding, but situation requires monitoring. Grandchild arrival provides additional security concern. Family presence complicates extraction protocols. Tom realized the entry referred to his own birth. His father had been torn between his duty to whatever he was protecting and his desire to have family nearby. The ultimate decision to drive his family away hadn't been weakness or alcoholism, it had been the sacrifice of a man choosing mission over personal happiness. "There's more," Martha said, pointing to entries from the 1990s. "After you left for Denver, Daniel's communications changed. He wasn't just reporting status anymore, he was requesting permission for emergency protocols." The later entries painted a picture of a man, under increasing pressure. References to secondary parties, investigating the ranch, equipment failures that threatened package security, and growing concerns that extraction authorization might never come. That afternoon, while Emma played at a neighbor's house, Tom and Martha attempted to decipher Daniel's final entries. The last coded message was dated just 3 months before his death. Package integrity confirmed, security protocols active, awaiting final instructions. If something happens to Guardian, Son has been prepared through inherited materials. Prepared how? Tom asked. Martha pulled out the brass compass they'd found by the hatch. Maybe with this. Those coordinates you couldn't identify, what if they're not for a location, but for something else? A combination maybe, or a reference point for the package location. Tom studied the engraved numbers with new understanding. Instead of latitude and longitude, they might represent layers of security dates, measurements, or coded references that would mean something only to someone who understood the full context. As evening approached, Martha helped Tom explore the radio equipment more thoroughly. Hidden beneath the main console, they discovered additional coded logs and what appeared to be emergency protocols for various scenarios. Daniel had planned for every contingency except the one that actually occurred before he could properly transfer his responsibilities. Tom, Martha said quietly, I think your father was waiting for official word that his mission was complete. Permission to reveal the truth, or at least transfer guardianship to proper authorities. When it never came, he had to improvise. The weight of Daniel's situation became clear. A young man recruited for what he'd thought was temporary duty, probably during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who'd found himself the permanent guardian of something too valuable to abandon. Decades had passed, governments had changed, but the secret remained classified, and the guardian remained at his post. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat in the kitchen studying everything they'd discovered. The coded journal, the radio logs, the compass coordinates, the evidence of underground constructional pieces of a puzzle his father had carried alone for 40 years. A sound outside made him look up. Headlights moved slowly down the ranch road, pausing near the gate before continuing past. Tom killed the kitchen lights and watched from the window as the vehicle made a second pass, this time stopping for several minutes with its engine running. The paranoia Daniel had lived with was becoming Tom's reality. Someone was watching the ranch, evaluating his progress, deciding whether the secrets buried beneath the broken arrow were still safe. Tom thought about Emma sleeping upstairs, trusting him to keep her safe in this new life they'd built. His daughter deserved better than the fear that had consumed her grandfather, but she also deserved the truth about Daniel's heroism and the inheritance that came with it. Tomorrow, he would take the compass coordinates and decoded journal entries back to the barn. Whatever combination or key those numbers represented, whatever his father had protected beneath the Wyoming prairie, Tom was going to open that hatch and finally understand the full scope of Daniel Callahan's sacrifice. The headlights returned a third time, moving even more slowly. Someone was definitely watching, evaluating, planning. Tom realized he might not have much time before external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave in civilian hands. He needed to solve his father's final puzzle before others solved it for him. Martha and Tom made their breakthrough Thursday evening, when Martha brought a magnifying glass to examine the government photographs more closely. Hidden behind Daniel's false wall panel, the black and white images showed her grandfather with men in suits standing before what was unmistakably a younger version of the Broken Arrow Ranch. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a figure partially obscured by shadow in one photograph. "That's Samuel Morrison, Jake's grandfather. He's not just visiting, he's giving some kind of presentation." The photographs told a story of official government business conducted in secret. Daniel Callahan, in military uniform, stood at attention beside civilian officials, while surveying equipment and construction materials were visible in the background. This hadn't been a simple land acquisition, it had been a major installation project. "Your father wasn't recruited randomly," Martha realized. "He was already military, probably selected specifically for this assignment. The ranch wasn't his family property, it was his duty station. Tom studied a photograph showing construction equipment near where the barn now stood. The civilian-dressed officials were examining blueprints, while Daniel and another soldier maintained security positions. One man's face was clearly visibly an older Samuel Morrison, directing the operation with obvious authority. So Jake's grandfather was involved from the beginning, Tom said. More than involved, he was in charge. Martha pulled out additional photographs that showed Morrison Sr. shaking hands with government officials. This was his operation, and your father was the security element assigned to protect it. The implications cascaded through Tom's understanding of the town's dynamics. Jake Morrison's hostility wasn't simple land greed, it was generational panic about family secrets being exposed. The Morrison family had been complicit in whatever classified operation had brought Daniel Callahan to Wyoming. That evening, Tom attempted to use the compass coordinates as a combination for the barn hatch's locking mechanism. The numbers engraved on the brass surface 41-7-23-61 could represent dates, measurements, or sequential inputs for a mechanical lock. Working by flashlight, Tom tried various interpretations of the numbers. As longitude and latitude, they pointed to locations in the Atlantic Ocean. As dates, they might reference specific days during the Cold War crisis. But when he tried them as a sequence for the hatch's combination lock, the fourth attempt produced a satisfying click. The steel hatch lifted with surprising ease, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The engineering was impressive: enforced concrete walls, professional ventilation systems, and electric lighting that activated automatically as Tom descended into what was clearly a government-built fallout shelter. The underground chamber was larger than Tom had imagined. Main room, storage alcoves, communication center, and living quarters that could have sustained several people for months. But it was the contents that took his breath away. Gold bars were stacked along one wall, with military precision, hundreds of them bearing official U.S. Treasury markings. Documents filled filing cabinets with labels like Operation Cornerstone, Emergency Asset Relocation, and Post-Crisis Recovery Protocols. Maps showed similar facilities throughout the western states, all connected by communication networks and supply chains. Tom found himself standing in what amounted to a backup vault for critical government assets relocated during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When nuclear war seemed imminent in 1962, valuable materials had been dispersed to secret locations throughout the country. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been one of those locations. But why had the assets never been retrieved? Tom examined the communication logs and found his answer in a file marked Mission Status Update 1963. The operation had been classified beyond normal levels when political priorities shifted after the crisis ended. Personnel involved had been sworn to secrecy indefinitely, with retrieval authorization dependent on conditions that apparently never materialized. Daniel Callahan had volunteered for what he thought was temporary duty and found himself the permanent guardian of assets worth tens of millions of dollars. The gold alone represented a substantial portion of America's strategic reserves during the Cold War's most dangerous period. Among the documents, Tom found his father's real service record. Daniel hadn't been a simple rancher who deteriorated into alcoholisms. He'd been a decorated intelligence officer selected for the most sensitive possible assignment. His apparent failure in civilian life had been an elaborate cover story to explain his isolation and discourage investigation. The personal cost was documented in Daniel's private notes, stored separately from official communications. Letters he'd written but never sent to his son, explaining the impossible choice between family and duty. Photographs of Tom growing up that Daniel had collected through distant observation. Records of financial support secretly provided through intermediaries during Tom's college years. I couldn't tell you the truth because the truth would have made you a target. One unsent letter read, "Better to let you think I was weak than to put you in danger. Better to be hated than to risk the security of something bigger than both of us." Tom sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of his father's sacrifice and his own misunderstanding. Daniel had let his family believe the worst about him to protect both them and his mission. The loneliness he'd endured, the reputation he'd accepted, the relationships he'd sacrificed, all necessary costs of guarding secrets that could have changed the course of the Cold War if compromised. Above ground, vehicle engines approached the ranch. Tom quickly photographed key documents with his phone before climbing the ladder and securing the hatch. Through the barn's broken siding, he saw multiple vehicles surrounding the farmhouse: Jake Morrison's truck, Richard Sterling's sedan, and two others he didn't recognize. Emma was inside, doing homework, unaware of the men gathering in their yard. Tom's heart raced as he realized the surveillance had escalated to direct action. Whatever patience these people had shown was apparently exhausted. He slipped through the barn's rear entrance and circled toward the house, staying low and using outbuildings for cover. The radio equipment in the attic suddenly made perfect sense. Daniel would have monitored exactly this type of situation, preparing for the day when external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave unguarded. Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Emma at the table, her schoolbooks spread around her like a fortress of normalcy. She looked up as vehicles' doors slammed outside, her expression shifting from curiosity to the wariness that had become too familiar since their arrival in Wyoming. Tom reached the back door as voices rose from the front yard. Jake Morrison was speaking with authority, directing the other men like someone accustomed to command. The family resemblance to his grandfather's photographs was unmistakable, the same cold confidence, the same assumption that others would follow his lead. "Emma," Tom called softly as he entered through the kitchen, "go upstairs to your room and stay there." His daughter looked at him with serious green eyes that missed nothing. "Are those the bad men from your worried voice?" Tom's heart clenched at her perceptive question. "Just some people who want to talk about grown-up things. I'll handle it." Emma gathered her books with the efficiency of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival signals. Before heading upstairs, she paused beside her father. "Dad, Grandpa's compass is still on the kitchen counter. Maybe you should put it somewhere safe." Tom pocketed the brass compass, realizing Emma understood more about their situation than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she was already thinking like someone who needed to protect family secrets. The knock on the front door was firm but polite, to the kind of authoritative courtesy that preceded ultimatums. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison flanked by Richard Sterling and two men whose bearings screamed federal authority, despite their civilian clothes. "Tom," Morrison said with false friendliness, "we need to talk. Mind if we come in?" "Actually, I do mind. Emma's doing homework." "This won't take long," Sterling replied, already pushing past Tom into the living room. "We understand you've been doing some exploring around the property. Found anything interesting?" Tom remained by the door, blocking further access to the house. "Just old ranch equipment and my father's personal effects." One of the federal men stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Agent Patterson, Department of Homeland Security. We have reason to believe this property contains materials relevant to national security. We'd appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter quietly." The words carried weight Tom couldn't ignore, but something in Patterson's manner felt wrong. Real federal agents would have arrived with warrants and backup, not skulked around rural properties with local conspirators. "What kind of materials?" Tom asked. Morrison's patience cracked slightly. "The kind that could get people hurt if they're mishandled by civilians who don't understand what they're dealing with." Tom thought about Emma upstairs, about the gold and documents in the underground chamber, about his father's decades of lonely service. Whatever game these men were playing, it wasn't official government business. "I think you should leave," Tom said. Sterling smiled without warmth. "Tom, be reasonable. This property has been nothing but trouble for your family. Take our offer, it's more than generous, and start fresh somewhere else." "With your daughter," Patterson added meaningfully. "Little girls need stability, safe neighborhoods, good schools. Wyoming can be dangerous for people who aren't careful." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tom felt anger building in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him through Sarah's illness and Emma's adjustment to life without her mother. "Get off my property," Tom said quietly. Morrison's mask finally slipped entirely. "Your property? Your drunk father couldn't even keep this place together. You think you can do better? My father was a better man than any of you understood. Your father was a security risk who should have been removed years ago," Sterling snapped. "The only reason he wasn't was because certain people believed his cover story was useful." Tom realized they'd revealed more than they intended. These men knew about Daniel's real work, had probably been monitoring the situation for years, waiting for the right moment to claim whatever assets his father had protected. "I'm not selling," Tom said firmly. Patterson reached inside his jacket, but before he could reveal whatever authority he intended to display, Martha Hayes' voice cut through the tension from the driveway. "Gentlemen, I hope you're not harassing my neighbors." Tom had never been happier to see anyone in his life. Martha approached with the confident stride of someone comfortable with confrontation, her historian's mind already cataloguing faces and license plates for future reference. "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison said with obvious displeasure, "this is a private conversation." "On a public road, with raised voices," Martha replied. "I think it's time you all went home." The federal agents, or whoever they actually were, exchanged glances with Morrison. Whatever they'd planned, it hadn't included witnesses, with Martha's credibility in the community. "This isn't over, Callahan," Morrison said as they moved toward their vehicles. "Some decisions can't be put off forever." Tom watched them drive away, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, having heard enough to understand their family was in danger. Martha entered the house with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this scenario before. "Tom, I think it's time we talked about getting some help. Real help, from people who can match whatever resources those men represent." Tom pulled the brass compass from his pocket, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. "Martha, what I found today changes everything. My father wasn't just guarding land, he was protecting something worth dying for." That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom led Martha to the barn by flashlight. The steel hatch opened smoothly now that he understood the combination, revealing the underground chamber that had been Daniel's greatest secret and heaviest burden. Martha descended the ladder in stunned silence, her historian's mind struggling to process the scope of what Daniel had protected for 4 decades. The gold bars gleaming under electric lights, the filing cabinets full of classified documents, the communication equipment still humming with standby power. It was like stepping into a perfectly preserved piece of Cold War history. "My God," Martha whispered, examining official documents bearing presidential seals. "Tom, this isn't just valuable, it's historically priceless. These are the actual emergency protocols for Operation Cornerstone." Tom showed her the files he'd discovered, including his father's real service record and the unsent letters, explaining his impossible situation. But it was the official operation files that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy they now faced. "Look at this," Martha said, holding up a document marked Personnel Assignment, Operation Cornerstone. Among the names listed were Samuel Morrison as Civilian Coordinator and Daniel Callahan as Security Element Commander. But the most shocking revelation came in a file marked Post-Crisis Asset Management. According to the documents, Operation Cornerstone had officially ended in 1964, with all assets supposedly returned to federal custody. The gold, documents, and equipment in the underground chamber should not have existed. This means the official records were falsified, Martha realized. Someone reported the assets as recovered when they were actually left here under Daniel's protection. Tom found the smoking gun in a file labeled Financial Reconciliation 1964. Samuel Morrison had signed documents certifying the complete removal of all classified materials from the Wyoming location, receiving substantial compensation for his cooperation in the operation's closure. But the assets had never been moved. Morrison's grandfather stole $50 million in government gold and blamed my father for its disappearance, Tom said, the pieces finally clicking together. That's why Daniel could never reveal the truth. He was protecting the government's assets from the man officially responsible for their return. Martha examined additional documents that painted a picture of systematic deception. Samuel Morrison had reported equipment failures and security compromises that never actually occurred, creating justification for emergency asset relocation that had never happened. He'd collected payment for services never rendered, while Daniel maintained actual security for assets officially listed as returned. Your father wasn't just a guardian, Martha said quietly. He was the only thing standing between $50 million in government gold and the family that had already stolen it once. The weight of Daniel's sacrifice became clear. He'd accepted a lifetime of isolation and family rejection to prevent the Morrison family from completing their theft. Every year of apparent failure had been another year of successful mission completion, protecting assets that didn't officially exist from people who couldn't officially be stopped. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. Recent correspondence, dating from just months before Daniel's death, showed that Jake Morrison had been pressuring federal contacts to declare the site officially closed and seal all records. Without Daniel's protection, the Morrison family was positioned to finally claim the assets they'd attempted to steal 40 years earlier. That's why Jake was so eager to buy the ranch, Tom realized. He knew what was buried here, and with my father dead, he thought he could finally complete what his grandfather started. Martha found evidence that Jake Morrison had been working with Richard Sterling's development company to create legitimate-looking land acquisition that would give them access to the underground chamber. The federal agents who'd visited that afternoon were probably private contractors hired to provide official-seeming pressure. Tom, this goes beyond simple greed, Martha said, examining communication logs. The Morrison family has been planning this for decades, waiting for Daniel to die so they could claim rightful inheritance to something they never owned. Among Daniel's personal files, Tom found his father's contingency plans. If the official guardianship ever ended, Daniel had prepared detailed evidence packages to be delivered to multiple federal agencies, news organizations, and congressional oversight committees. He'd spent 40 years documenting the Morrison family's crimes while maintaining his cover as a failed rancher. He was building a case, Tom said, reading his father's methodical notes. Every conversation with Jake, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off the land, Daniel recorded everything. The final revelation came in Daniel's last will and testament, filed separately from the estate documents Tom had received. In this version, Daniel explicitly transferred not just the ranch property, but all associated federal assets and security responsibilities to his son, along with detailed instructions for contacting legitimate government authorities. Your father made you the legal guardian of classified government property, Martha said. That's why Jake Morrison can't just take the land by force. The federal assets belong to you now, and stealing them would be treason. Tom understood why his father had maintained the charade until his death. As long as Daniel appeared to be a harmless drunk on worthless land, the Morrison family had been content to wait. But Tom's arrival and obvious competence had accelerated their timeline, forcing them to act before he could discover the truth. The radio equipment suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission on Daniel's emergency frequency. Tom and Martha froze as a voice emerged from the static knot, the local surveillance they'd been monitoring, but something far more official. Broken Arrow Base, this is Overwatch Command. Respond immediately. We show anomalous activity at your location. Tom stared at the radio, realizing that somewhere in the federal government, Daniel's 40-year mission was still being monitored. The real authorities knew about the underground chamber, the protected assets, and possibly the Morrison family's attempts to claim them. Martha grabbed the microphone with historian's boldness. Overwatch Command, this is Martha Hayes speaking for new Site Commander Tom Callahan. Daniel Callahan died 3 months ago, and his son has inherited guardianship responsibilities. A long pause. Then, confirm your identity, Mrs. Hayes. We show you as Daniel Callahan's designated emergency contact. Confirmed. Tom Callahan is Daniel's son and legal heir. We have evidence of unauthorized attempts to access classified materials by local parties. Understood. Federal assets will be securing your location within the hour. Maintain current position and allow no access to restricted areas. Tom felt something lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd inherited without understanding, now being transferred to people who could handle it properly. His father's long vigil was finally ending with the arrival of legitimate federal authority. But through the barn's broken siding, Tom could see lights moving across the ranch property. Jake Morrison and his allies weren't waiting for federal intervention. They were making their final attempt to claim the assets before official help could arrive. "Martha," Tom said urgently, "we need to get back to Emma." They secured the underground chamber and ran toward the farmhouse, where Tom could see shadows moving around the building. Jake Morrison had brought more men this time, and they were no longer bothering with legal pretense. The brass compass in Tom's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of his father's legacy. Daniel Callahan had spent 40 years protecting government assets from thieves who wore the mask of respectability. Now Tom faced the same choice: protect what his father had died guarding, or let the Morrison family finally complete their decades-old theft. Above them, Emma's bedroom light was still on. His daughter was awake, probably listening to the sounds of men surrounding their home. Tom thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the inheritance that came with choosing principle over personal safety. He was no longer just a widowed mechanic trying to build a new life for his daughter. He was the guardian of secrets worth dying for, facing the same impossible choice that had defined his father's life. The difference was that this time, help was coming. Tom and Martha reached the farmhouse to find Jake Morrison's men positioned around the property with military precision. These weren't local ranch hands. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals, using night vision equipment and communication devices that suggested serious financial backing. Emma met them at the back door, her face pale but determined. "Dad, I called Mrs. Rodriguez like you taught me to do if strangers came to the house. She's calling the sheriff." Tom hugged his daughter, amazed by her presence of mind under pressure. Sarah's strength lived on in Emma's courage, the same quiet bravery that had carried his wife through her final battle with cancer. "Good thinking, sweetheart. Now I need you to go to your room and stay away from the windows until this is over." "Are they here for Grandpa's secret?" Tom looked into his daughter's serious green eyes, realizing she'd understood far more than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she'd already figured out that their family was guarding something important. "Yes, Em. They want something that belongs to our family, something Grandpa spent his whole life protecting." Emma nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "Then we can't let them have it." Martha was monitoring the radio equipment Tom had brought up from the underground chamber, coordinating with the federal response team while tracking Jake Morrison's communications. The official help was still 20 minutes away, but Morrison's men were moving into final positions around the house. "Tom, they're not planning to negotiate," Martha said grimly. "I'm hearing orders about securing the package and eliminating complications. They know federal authorities are coming." Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Jake Morrison himself approaching the front door, flanked by Richard Sterling and 2 men whose tactical gear left no doubt about their intentions. This was the Morrison family's final play claim, the assets by force, before legitimate government authority could intervene. Tom made a decision that would have made his father proud. He activated the emergency beacon Daniel had hidden in the radio equipment, broadcasting a distress signal on frequencies monitored by multiple federal agencies. If the Morrison family wanted to steal government gold, they'd have to do it with official witnesses. The knock on the front door was sharp and demanding. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison holding official-looking documents, his usual false friendliness replaced by cold determination. "Tom, these are federal seizure orders for this property. You have 30 minutes to evacuate before we begin asset recovery operations." Tom examined the papers, noting discrepancies that confirmed his suspicions. "These documents are fake, Jake. The letterhead's wrong. The seal's a photocopy, and the signature doesn't match federal format. Morrison's mask finally dropped completely. It doesn't matter what you think you know, Callahan. By morning, this property will be under federal control and you'll be another sad story about a city boy who couldn't handle ranch life. Except federal authorities are already en route, Martha said from behind Tom. Real federal authorities who know the difference between legitimate asset recovery and organized theft. Sterling stepped forward with obvious menace. Mrs. Hayes, you're interfering with national security operations. That could be considered treason. What could be considered treason, Martha replied sharply, is a 40-year conspiracy to steal classified government property while filing false reports with federal agencies. Tom realized they were buying time, keeping the Morrison group talking until help arrived. But Emma was upstairs, and the men surrounding the house weren't going to wait for official intervention. Jake, Tom said quietly, your grandfather tried to steal $50 million in government gold and blame my father for its disappearance. Daniel spent 40 years protecting those assets from your family's theft. I have the original Operation Cornerstone files that prove everything. Morrison's face went white, then flushed with anger. Your father was a drunk who couldn't handle his responsibilities. The assets were officially transferred in 1964 to your grandfather, who reported them as returned to federal custody while actually leaving them buried on this ranch. I have Samuel Morrison's signed receipts for assets he never moved, payment records for services he never provided, and 40 years of Daniel's documentation proving the gold never left Wyoming. The accusation hung in the air between them, decades of family secrets finally exposed. Jake Morrison had grown up knowing his family's wealth was built on theft, waiting for the day he could complete what his grandfather had started. Even if that were true, Sterling said, you can't prove anything. The official records support our version of events. Actually, I can prove everything, Martha interjected, holding up a file folder, because Daniel Callahan spent 4 decades building a legal case against your family. Every conversation, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off this land documented, recorded, and filed with federal oversight agencies. Tom pulled out his father's original service record, the one that showed Daniel as a decorated intelligence officer rather than a failed rancher. My father was a hero who sacrificed his family relationships to protect government assets from thieves. The only reason your family isn't in federal prison is because Daniel chose duty over personal vindication. Morrison's composure cracked completely. He gestured to his men, who began moving closer to the house. None of that matters now. We have the manpower, we have the equipment, and we have a 30-year head start on planning this operation. What you have, said a new voice from the darkness, is about 30 seconds to surrender before federal agents place you under arrest. Tom had never been happier to hear official authority. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the ranch property, revealing FBI tactical teams positioned around Morrison's men. Helicopters circled overhead while armored vehicles blocked all escape routes. Agent Sarah Chen stepped into the light, her badge clearly visible and her authority unquestionable. Jake Morrison, Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft of federal property, filing false documents with government agencies, and attempting to steal classified materials. Morrison made one last desperate attempt. Agent Chen, these people are interfering with legitimate asset recovery operations. We have federal authorization. What you have, Chen replied, are forged documents and a 40-year-old crime that's finally catching up with you. Daniel Callahan was a federal asset guardian, and his son is now the legal custodian of classified materials you've been trying to steal since 1964. Tom watched Jake Morrison's world collapse as federal agents secured the scene. The man who'd grown up believing he was entitled to stolen gold was finally facing the consequences of his family's generational crime. Emma appeared at Tom's side, having watched the entire confrontation from the stairs. She studied Jake Morrison with the same serious attention she brought to difficult homework problems. "Dad," she said quietly, "is Mr. Morrison going to jail?" I think so, sweetheart. He tried to take something that didn't belong to him. Good, Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. Grandpa wouldn't have liked that. Agent Chen approached Tom with the kind of respectful attention given to someone who'd just inherited significant federal responsibilities. Mr. Callahan, we need to discuss the classified assets your father was protecting. The gold and documents will need to be officially transferred, but given your family's service record, there are options we should explore. Tom looked at his daughter, then at Martha Hayes, who'd become more than a neighbor in their weeks of discovery. He thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the legacy his father had left them. Agent Chen, I'd like to hear those options, but first, I have some questions about my father's real service record and what kind of man he actually was. He was the kind of man, Chen replied, who spent 40 years protecting his country's assets while letting his family believe he was a failure. There aren't many people with that level of dedication. As federal agents processed the scene and the Morrison family's conspiracy finally faced justice, Tom realized his inheritance was larger than he'd imagined. Not just 800 acres of Wyoming ranch land, not just $50 million in government gold, but the knowledge that Daniel Callahan had been a hero worth emulating. Emma slipped her small hand into his as they watched Jake Morrison being led away in handcuffs. The girl who'd grown up thinking her grandfather was a shameful family secret now knew he'd been a guardian of something precious. The crisis was ending, but Tom's real responsibilities were just beginning. The town meeting Tom called for the following Saturday filled Sweetwater's community center beyond capacity. Word had spread quickly about the federal operation at the Broken Arrow Ranch, and everyone wanted to understand what had really happened to Daniel Callahan and why the Morrison family had been arrested. Tom stood at the front of the room, holding his father's final letter, the one document he'd saved for this moment. Emma sat in the front row beside Martha Hayes, her small face serious with the weight of family truth finally being told. Most of you knew my father as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart. Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. I believed that story too for most of my life. I was wrong, and so were all of you. He opened the sealed envelope Daniel had left specifically for this purpose, reading his father's words to the community that had scorned him. If Tom is reading this to the people of Sweetwater, it means the truth can finally be told. I came to Wyoming in 1962 as a military intelligence officer assigned to protect classified government assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the immediate danger passed, I volunteered to remain as guardian of materials too sensitive to move. I let you believe I was weak because weakness was my disguise. I let you believe I was a failure because failure was my protection. I let my family believe I was worthless because their disappointment kept them safe from the truth. For 40 years, I protected $50 million in federal gold and classified documents from people who would have used them to harm our country. I accepted your scorn, your mockery, and your pity because they were the price of keeping America's secrets safe. I was never the man you thought I was. I was the man my country needed me to be. The room fell silent as Tom's voice carried his father's final words. In the back, he could see townspeople who'd whispered cruel jokes about Daniel Callahan, struggling to reconcile their assumptions with this new reality. Jake Morrison's elderly supporters looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd spent decades scorning a war hero while supporting a family of thieves. The revelation that Samuel Morrison had attempted to steal government gold while Daniel protected it reframed 40 years of local history. My father died alone and scorned, Tom continued, protecting assets that belonged to all of us. While Jake Morrison's family built their wealth on attempted theft of federal property, Daniel Callahan stood guard over America's emergency reserves. Emma stood up with the courage her mother had possessed, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room, "My grandpa was a hero. He protected important things even when it made people think bad things about him. That's what heroes do, they do what's right even when it's hard." The 8-year-old simple truth cut through decades of adult assumptions and prejudice. Tom watched faces change throughout the room as people processed the scope of their misjudgment. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, was the first to stand. "Daniel Callahan deserves our apology and our gratitude. Emma, your grandfather was a better man than any of us realized." Others followed the librarian who'd known Daniel as a young soldier, the mechanic who'd occasionally worked on his truck, neighbors who'd seen him as a failure rather than recognizing his sacrifice. One by one, the community began acknowledging the debt they owed to a man they'd never understood. But not everyone accepted the truth gracefully. Morrison's remaining allies attempted to defend their position, claiming Daniel's story was fabricated to justify Tom's inheritance. "This is all very convenient," said Robert Hayes, Jake's longtime supporter. "A mysterious federal operation that nobody can verify, classified documents that nobody can examine, and a fortune in gold that conveniently makes the Callahan family rich." Tom had prepared for this challenge. He nodded to Agent Chen, who'd agreed to attend the meeting in an official capacity. "Mr. Hayes," Chen said, standing and displaying her federal credentials, "I can verify that Daniel Callahan served with distinction as a guardian of classified federal assets for 4 decades. The operation was real, the gold was real, and the Morrison family's attempt to steal it was real." She continued with the authority that only legitimate federal agents possessed. "The documents and assets Tom Callahan inherited are currently under federal protection, and their existence has been verified by multiple agencies. Daniel Callahan's service record has been declassified specifically to allow this community to understand the truth about his sacrifice." The room stirred as people realized they were hearing official confirmation from federal authority. The wild story of buried gold and secret operations wasn't local legend, it was documented history. Tom felt the mood in the room shifting as his father's reputation transformed from shame to honor. Emma beamed with pride, finally able to hold her head high about her grandfather's legacy. "There's something else," Tom said, ready to make the announcement that would cement Daniel's place in local history. "The federal government has agreed to let me establish a memorial foundation using a portion of the recovered assets. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Fund will provide college scholarships for Wyoming students who demonstrate the same quiet courage my father showed for 40 years. The applause that followed Tom's announcement was spontaneous and sustained. People who had mocked Daniel Callahan for decades were rising to their feet, honoring the memory of a man whose sacrifice they'd never understood. But the moment was interrupted by a commotion near the back of the room. Richard Sterling pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and desperation. Federal charges had been filed, but he was still free on bond and apparently unwilling to accept defeat. "This is all lies," Sterling shouted. "You people are being manipulated by a clever conman who's stolen federal property and invented a story to justify it." Agent Chen moved to intercede, but Tom held up his hand. Some confrontations needed to happen in public, with witnesses, so the truth could be established beyond doubt. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said calmly, "would you like to see the original government contract that proves my father's assignment?" From his jacket, Tom produced the document he'd brought specifically for this moment, the official Operation Cornerstone assignment orders, bearing Daniel Callahan's name, federal seals, and authentication stamps that couldn't be forged. Sterling examined the papers with growing desperation, realizing they were genuine federal documents that destroyed his family's version of events. The Morrison-Sterling partnership had been built on lies that were now exposed in front of the entire community. "Even if this is real," Sterling said, his voice cracking, "it doesn't change anything. The assets were officially transferred in 1964. We have the paperwork." Martha Hayes stood with the confidence of a historian who'd spent weeks researching the truth. "What you have, Mr. Sterling, are forged documents created by Samuel Morrison to cover up his attempted theft. The real transfer orders were never signed because the assets were never moved." She produced copies of the authentic federal records, showing the discrepancies between Morrison's fraudulent reports and the actual government files. The evidence was overwhelming: 40 years of systematic deception exposed by careful historical research. Emma rose again, her young voice cutting through the adult complications with startling clarity. "Mr. Sterling, why are you so angry about my grandpa being a hero? Shouldn't you be happy that someone protected important things for our country?" The question, asked with 8-year-old innocence, revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Sterling's position. He was angry not because Daniel's story was false, but because its truth exposed his own family's criminality. "Little girl," Sterling said with barely controlled rage, "you don't understand the complexities of adult business." "I understand right and wrong," Emma replied with her mother's quiet strength. "Grandpa did what was right, even when it was hard. You're trying to take things that don't belong to you. That's wrong." The community watched this exchange, with growing clarity about who deserved their support. A decorated war hero who'd sacrificed everything for duty, or the families who'd built their wealth on attempted theft of federal assets. Agent Chen finally intervened with federal authority. "Mr. Sterling, you're under federal indictment and approaching a minor in a threatening manner. I strongly suggest you leave immediately." But Sterling's composure had completely cracked. Years of planning, decades of assumed entitlement, and generational wealth built on criminal conspiracy were collapsing around him. "You people don't understand what you're destroying," he screamed. "The Morrison family built this town. We provided jobs, investment, community leadership for 3 generations. Built on stolen federal gold," Martha said quietly. "Leadership based on criminal conspiracy. Investment using money that belonged to the American people." Tom stepped forward with the calm authority he'd inherited from his father. "Mr. Sterling, your partnership with Jake Morrison is over. The assets you tried to steal are being returned to federal custody, and the community you tried to manipulate now knows the truth." "This isn't finished," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you've won, but there are consequences to destroying established families. Accidents happen to people who interfere with serious business." The threat was clear and witnessed by the entire room. Agent Chen immediately moved to arrest Sterling for threatening a federal witness, but Tom held up his hand again. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said with Daniel's quiet courage, "my father faced much more dangerous people than you for 40 years and never backed down. I inherited his responsibilities and his resolve. Threatening my family was a mistake." Emma moved to stand beside her father, her small hand finding his with the same trust she'd always shown. Martha Hayes joined them, creating a visual representation of the alliance that had uncovered the truth. The community saw 3 popular working father, his brave daughter, and a dedicated historian standing against wealth and corruption with nothing but truth and courage. The moral choice was clear. Sheriff Williams, who'd been listening from the doorway, finally acted with the authority Sterling's federal charges demanded. "Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for threatening federal witnesses and interfering with a federal investigation." As Sterling was led away in handcuffs, joining Jake Morrison in federal custody, the room erupted in genuine applause. Not polite community theater, but real appreciation for justice finally being served. Tom looked out at faces that had changed from suspicion to respect, from skepticism to support. Daniel Callahan's reputation was finally restored, and Emma could grow up proud of her grandfather's heroism. The climax was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Tom stood in the same barn where Emma had first noticed the disturbed earth that changed their lives forever. But everything was different now. Fresh paint covered weathered siding, new equipment filled the workspace, and through the open doors, he could see Emma playing with friends from schoolchildren who now competed for invitations to visit the famous Broken Arrow Ranch. The underground chamber had been officially sealed after federal agents completed their asset recovery, but not before Tom had photographed everything for the historical record. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Museum, housed in the renovated farmhouse, now displayed selected documents and artifacts that told the story of one man's 40-year vigil protecting America's secrets. Martha Hayes approached from the house, carrying a framed photograph that would complete the museum's main exhibit. It showed Tom, Emma, and Martha at the ranch's dedication ceremony, flanked by federal officials who'd finally acknowledged Daniel's service. But more importantly, it captured three people who'd become a family through shared discovery and mutual respect. "The new display looks perfect," Martha said, admiring the museum setup. "Emma did a wonderful job writing the description of her grandfather's compass." Tom smiled, thinking about his daughter's simple but powerful words. "This compass helped my grandpa find his way through hard times. It helped him remember that some directions are worth following, even when they're difficult." The brass compass now rested in a place of honor, its engraved coordinates finally understood as the combination that had protected $50 million in government assets. But for Emma, it had become something more, a symbol of the courage required to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. "Any regrets about not keeping more of the gold?" Martha asked with gentle teasing. Tom looked out at the thriving ranch, the happy children, the community that had embraced them after learning the truth. The federal government had been generous in their settlement, providing enough compensation to secure Emma's future while ensuring the ranch could operate as both a working farm and historical site. "Not for a minute," Tom said honestly. "Dad protected that gold because it belonged to the American people. Keeping it would have made us rich, but returning it made us part of something bigger." The Daniel Callahan Memorial Scholarship Fund had already awarded its first grants to Wyoming students, demonstrating academic excellence and moral courage. Emma took special pride in reading the applications, looking for young people who reminded her of her grandfather's quiet heroism. Jake Morrison and Richard Sterling had been sentenced to federal prison for their decades-long conspiracy to steal government assets. Their family's wealth, built on attempted theft, was being systematically returned to federal custody. The Morrison Ranch would be sold at auction, its proceeds used to compensate taxpayers for 40 years of criminal conspiracy. Speaking of the Memorial Fund, Martha said, "We received another application that I think Emma will love. A young man from Cheyenne who wants to study military history and preserve stories like your father's." Tom felt the satisfaction that came from seeing Daniel's sacrifice inspire the next generation. His father's reputation had been completely restored, but more importantly, his example was motivating young people to choose service over self-interest. Emma ran toward them with the boundless energy of a child who'd found her place in the world. At 9 years old, she moved through Sweetwater with the confidence of someone who belonged, whose family history was a source of pride rather than shame. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we can bring Grandpa's radio equipment to school for the Cold War presentation." Tom laughed at his daughter's enthusiasm. The same equipment Daniel had used to maintain contact with federal authorities was now helping teach local children about American history during its most dangerous period. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Em. Your grandfather would have loved knowing his work was helping educate young people." Martha watched this exchange with the warmth of someone who'd gained more than she'd expected when she'd first approached two strangers in a ranch driveway. She'd come to help preserve local history but had found a family worth joining. That evening, the three of them sat on the restored porch swing, watching Wyoming's endless sky fade from blue to gold to deep purple. Emma was reading a letter from Agent Chen, who'd become something of a pen pal since the federal operation concluded. "Agent Chen says they found 3 more sites like Grandpa's," Emma reported. "Other people who protected government secrets for a really long time without getting credit." Tom felt connected to those unknown guardians, ordinary people who'd accepted extraordinary responsibilities because their country needed them. Daniel hadn't been unique in his sacrifice, just uniquely isolated in carrying it alone. "Maybe someday we can help tell their stories too," Tom suggested. Emma's face lit up with the possibility. "We could expand the museum, show how lots of people were heroes even when nobody knew it." Martha squeezed Tom's hand with affection that had grown from partnership into something deeper over their months of shared discovery. They'd built a relationship on mutual respect and common purpose, the kind of mature love that grew from understanding rather than passion alone. "Your father would be proud," Martha said quietly, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become." Tom looked at Emma, curled against his side, at Martha, whose wisdom had guided them through their darkest moments, at the ranch that had transformed from symbol of failure into beacon of hope. Daniel's sacrifice had cost him his family relationships, but it had ultimately restored them across generations. The brass compass sat on the porch table beside them, its needle pointing steadily north toward mountains that no longer seemed impossibly distant. Tom understood now that some paths were worth taking not because they were easy, but because they led toward truth, honor, and the kind of legacy that made sacrifice meaningful. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder as Wyoming's stars emerged in their full glory, the same stars Daniel had watched during 40 years of lonely vigil, waiting for the day when truth could finally be told. Tom carried his daughter inside to her bedroom, tucking her in beneath quilts Martha had made, and books about heroes, both famous and forgotten. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight their family was complete and their history was clear. Daniel Callahan had been a man worth emulating, and his legacy would live on through the granddaughter who bore his courage and the son who'd finally understood the true meaning of inheritance. Sometimes the people who've sacrificed the most are the ones with the most to give. On Christmas Eve, a father working as a baggage handler watches families missing their holiday dinners because a plane won't start. The mechanics give up. The CEO panics. But Noah Calderon remembers fixing fighter jets before he gave up everything for his son. When he shouts, "I can fix that plane," across the airport, most people laugh. Security rushes over. But the airline's CEO sees something special in his eyes. She takes a chance on him. He fixes the plane in minutes. Then she offers him a job that could save the airline and destroy his custody case. But what happens when they discover someone is sabotaging the planes on purpose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning cold bit through Noah Calderon's worn orange safety vest as he guided another Boeing 737 toward Gate B-12 at Denver International Airport. His breath formed small clouds in the December air, dissipating quickly in the controlled chaos of the airport's operations. At 38, Noah had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent years working with machinery, but his eyes held a sharpness that spoke of deeper knowledge he'd carefully buried beneath years of routine. In his breast pocket, wrapped in faded leather, sat a challenge coin from his days with the 355th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. Most days, he forgot it was there. Today, as families hurried past him toward their Christmas destinations, the coin felt heavier than usual. "Dad, you're doing that thing again." 10-year-old Mateo Calderon sat in the employee break room, homework spread across a plastic table that had seen better decades. His dark hair fell into eyes that mirrored his father's intelligence, though without the weight of compromise that shadowed Noah's gaze. "What thing?" Noah asked, pulling off his safety gloves and settling into the chair across from his son. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and the industrial disinfectant that seemed to permeate every corner of the airport. "You get this look when you watch the planes, like you're thinking about something far away." Mateo closed his math workbook and studied his father with the unsettling perception that only children possess. "Mom used to say the same thing." Noah's chest tightened at the mention of Elena. 3 years since their divorce, and her absence still felt like a missing piece in conversations with their son. "Just making sure everything runs smooth, me, Joe. That's my job." But Mateo was right, and they both knew it. When Noah watched the aircraft taxi and depart, part of him was calculating thrust-to-weight ratios, analyzing the subtle sounds of turbofan engines, and mentally troubleshooting systems most people never thought about. It was a habit he couldn't shake, even though he'd walked away from that world 12 years ago. The framed photograph on his small locker told the story he rarely shared. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon stood beside a young Noah in front of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, both wearing flight suits and the easy smiles of men who understood the machines that defied gravity. Miguel had been a test pilot, one of the best, until a system failure during a routine training flight took him away when Noah was 16. "Your grandfather would have liked this place," Noah said, nodding toward the window where a United flight was pushing back from the gate. All these different aircraft, all the complex systems working together. He always said airports were like symphonies, thousands of moving parts creating something beautiful. Mateo followed his father's gaze. "Will you tell me about him again? About how he taught you about planes?" Noah's throat constricted. Miguel Calderon had been more than a father. He'd been Noah's first and greatest teacher. Every weekend, they'd spend hours in the garage, taking apart radios and small engines, with Miguel explaining how electrical systems worked, how mechanical components interacted, how to diagnose problems by sound and feel rather than just by manuals. He had this way of seeing machines, Noah said, his voice soft with memory. Not just as collections of parts, but as living systems. He'd listen to an engine and hear stories where it had been stressed, what components were wearing out, what needed attention before it became a problem. Like you do with the baggage conveyors. Noah smiled. It was true. Just last week, he'd heard a subtle change in the motor housing of Carousel 3 and had quietly notified maintenance before it seized up completely. The other handlers had called it lucky, guessing. But Noah knew better. Some instincts never fade, no matter how deeply you try to bury them. "Dad, why did you stop fixing airplanes?" The question hung in the recycled air between them. Noah had answered it a dozen different ways over the years, but never with complete honesty. The truth was more complicated than a 10-year-old should have to understand. When Elena had gotten pregnant with Mateo, Noah had been 3 years into his aerospace engineering program at Colorado State University, working part-time as an Air Force contractor. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwanted until Elena's complications required bed rest for the final 4 months. Someone had to work full-time to keep their small apartment and pay for medical bills that insurance didn't cover. Someone had to be present, reliable, immediately available. The choice had seemed temporary then. Finish the degree later, get back into aerospace when things stabilized. But life had other plans. Elena's postpartum depression, Mateo's early childhood asthma that required constant vigilance, the slow erosion of a marriage under the weight of financial stress and delayed dreams. By the time the divorce papers were signed, Noah had been handling baggage for 8 years. It was steady work, union protected, with benefits and a schedule that allowed him to be present for Mateo's school events, doctor appointments, and the 1,000 small moments that make up a childhood. He'd become very good at convincing himself it was enough. Sometimes life asks you to choose between what you want and what matters most, Noah said finally. You were what mattered most. Mateo absorbed this with the serious expression he wore when processing adult complexities. But you still remember how to fix planes, right? I remember some things. Then why don't you fix planes here, at the airport? Noah glanced around the break room, noting the faded safety posters and the schedule board where his name appeared under baggage handling evening shift. How could he explain that walking away from your expertise felt different than walking away from a job? That every day he saw problems he could solve, systems he could improve, inefficiencies he could address, but that speaking up would only highlight how far he'd fallen from where he'd started. It's complicated, my Joe. Different kinds of work require different kinds of training, different certifications, and I'm good at what I do now. It wasn't entirely a lie. Noah was exceptionally good at baggage handling. He knew every piece of equipment, every safety protocol, every shortcut that saved time without compromising security. His supervisors valued his reliability, his willingness to work holidays, his calm competence during the chaos of flight delays and weather emergencies. But being good at something wasn't the same as being called to it. The break room door opened, and Dave Martinez, Noah's supervisor, stuck his head inside. Calderon, we've got a situation at gate C15. Mechanical delay on the 6:30 to Phoenix. They're asking for extra hands to help passengers with connections. Noah checked his watch for 47 p.m. Nearly 3 hours left in his shift. On my way. He turned to Mateo. Finish your homework. Mrs. Chen will keep an eye on you until I'm done. Mrs. Chen, the kind elderly woman who managed the employee childcare area, had become a surrogate grandmother to Mateo over the years. She asked no questions about why a 10-year-old spent most evenings at the airport, accepting Noah's explanation that family helped family, and sometimes family was whatever worked. As Noah walked through the terminal toward gate C15, he found himself studying the faces of delayed passengers with the empathy of someone who understood disappointment. A young mother bounced a crying toddler while checking her phone repeatedly. An elderly man in a military dress uniform sat straight-backed in his chair, staring at the departure board with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait. 3 college-aged kids shared a bag of chips and tried to make light of missing Christmas Eve dinner with their families. These were the people who mattered, Noah reminded himself, not the complex technical problems he sometimes glimpsed through open cockpit doors or maintenance bay windows. Not the sophisticated diagnostic challenges that made his fingers itch to dive into wiring harnesses and computer modules. The people, the families trying to get home, the reliable service that kept the world connected. At gate C15, the scene was controlled chaos. The gate agent, a young woman whose nameplate read Jennifer, was fielding questions from frustrated passengers while coordinators worked their phones to arrange alternative flights. Through the window, Noah could see the aircraft, a regional CRJ-900, with its engine cowlings open and 2 mechanics shaking their heads over something in the avionics bay. "What's the story?" Noah asked Dave as they approached the gate podium. "Avionics problem. Something with the flight management computer. Mechanics say it might be a software issue, might be hardware. Could be 30 minutes, could be 3 hours. Dave shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd seen it all before. "They want us to help manage the passenger flow, maybe set up some rebooking stations." Noah nodded, but his attention had drifted to the technical conversation happening at the aircraft. One of the mechanics was holding a diagnostic tablet, gesturing at readouts that Noah couldn't see from this distance but could imagine. The other was on a radio, probably conferring with maintenance control about parts availability and repair timelines. "I'll start setting up chairs for the rebooking queue," Noah said, but part of his mind was already analyzing the problem. Flight management computers in regional jets were notorious for software conflicts, especially during temperature transitions. The fix was usually straightforward if you understood the boot sequence and knew which modules to restart in which order. As he arranged chairs and helped passengers understand their options, Noah found himself listening to fragments of the technical discussion. Words like initialization failure and corrupted database drifted across the gate area, classic symptoms of a software glitch that would look mysterious to technicians who approached it as a hardware problem. The framed photograph in his locker might as well have been calling his name. Miguel Calderon had taught his son that understanding machines meant understanding their language, just the official diagnostic codes, but the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed the real story. Noah could hear that language now, in the frustration of the mechanics and the specific symptoms they were describing. But it wasn't his place to interfere. He was baggage handling, not aircraft maintenance. He had a son to think about, a custody arrangement that depended on stability and predictability. Speaking up would only create complications he couldn't afford. So Noah arranged chairs and answered passenger questions and tried to ignore the growing certainty that he could solve the problem grounding flight 1247 in about 10 minutes, if anyone had bothered to ask. 3 hours later, as his shift finally ended and he collected Mateo from the childcare area, the CRJ-900 was still sitting at gate C15 with its cowlings open. The passengers had long since been rebooked on other flights or given hotel vouchers for the night. The mechanics had called it a day, planning to return with fresh eyes and possibly a replacement module in the morning. "Did they fix the airplane?" Matteo asked, as they walked through the nearly empty terminal toward the parking garage. "Not yet," Noah replied, fingering the challenge coin in his pocket. "Some problems take time. But you knew how to fix it, didn't you?" Noah stopped walking and looked down at his son, whose perception continued to unsettle him. "What makes you say that?" You had that look again, the one you get when you're thinking about planes, but sadder. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the Colorado landscape, dusting the parked aircraft and ground equipment with a thin layer of white. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and somewhere a family wouldn't be together because a computer module needed to be reinitialized in the correct sequence. "Sometimes, mijo," Noah said as they reached their aging Honda Civic, "the hardest part about being able to fix something is knowing when it's not your job to try." But as he drove home through the early snowfall, Noah couldn't shake the image of that grounded aircraft, or the sound of passengers learning their Christmas plans had been disrupted by a problem he understood completely. The challenge coin seemed to weigh more with each passing mile, carrying the accumulated weight of 12 years of roads not taken and expertise left unused. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new passengers, and new problems. And Noah would watch it all from the edges, reliable and competent, and safely invisible, while the machines he understood better than most continued their complex dance just beyond his reach. Christmas Eve morning arrived, with the kind of bitter cold that made aircraft systems temperamental and ground crews miserable. Noah clocked in at 6 a.m. to find Denver International Airport already buzzing with holiday travelers, their faces mixing excitement and anxiety in equal measure. The departure boards showed a sea of green, on-time indicators, but Noah had worked enough holiday shifts to know that wouldn't last. By 10 a.m., his prediction proved accurate. The first mechanical delay appeared on the border Southwest flight to Las Vegas with a hydraulic issue, then a United flight to Chicago with a generator problem. Airport operations moved into the controlled urgency that Noah recognized from years of holiday chaos management. He was loading baggage onto Flight 847 to Seattle when the announcement echoed across Concourse B. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a mechanical issue, Mountain Air Flight 293 to Phoenix has been delayed indefinitely. Passengers should remain in the gate area for further updates." Noah glanced toward Gate B17, where he could see the familiar sight of frustrated travelers gathering around the gate podium. The aircrafter CRJ 700 regional jetsat, motionless at the jetway, its auxiliary power unit running but no other signs of life. "Another Christmas Eve special," muttered Jake Hernandez, Noah's loading partner. "That's the third mechanical this morning. Holiday travel's cursed, man." Noah finished securing the cargo net and walked with Jake toward their next assignment. As they passed Gate B17, he couldn't help but notice the unusual number of people in maintenance uniforms gathered around the aircraft. Two mechanics stood beside an open avionics bay, while a third held what looked like a diagnostic tablet. Their body language spoke of genuine confusion rather than routine troubleshooting. The gate agent, a harried-looking woman in her 50s, was fielding increasingly aggressive questions from passengers. A businessman in an expensive suit was demanding to know why a simple computer problem was taking so long to fix. A young mother held a crying infant while trying to explain to her 6-year-old why they might miss Christmas dinner with Grandma. "Folks, I understand your frustration," the gate agent was saying into her handheld microphone. "Our maintenance team is working diligently to resolve the issue. As soon as we have more information, I'll make another announcement." Noah slowed his pace, his trained ear picking up fragments of conversation between the mechanics. Words like cascade failure and primary bus drifted across the gate area. He found himself analyzing the symptoms without conscious intention, the way his father had taught him to listen to machines. "You coming, Calderon?" Jake called from 20 feet ahead. "We've got the Nashville flight to load." "Yeah, 1 second." Noah lingered near the gate, ostensibly organizing equipment, but actually observing the maintenance situation. The lead mechanic was shaking his head and closing the diagnostic tablet with the frustrated motion of someone who'd run out of ideas. Through the aircraft's open cabin door, Noah could see into the cockpit where the captain and first officer were running through checklists with the methodical patience of professionals who understood that some problems couldn't be rushed. But their repeated attempts to initialize various systems suggested they were encountering the same failures the ground crew was seeing. A new voice cut through the gate area, noise authoritative, female, with the precise diction of someone accustomed to command. "What's the situation, Tom?" Noah turned to see a woman in her early 40s approaching the lead mechanic. She wore a crisp navy blazer over dark slacks, and her bearing suggested management rather than operations. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her eyes moved constantly, taking in details with the rapid assessment of someone who made decisions under pressure. This had to be Victoria Hale, the airline's new CEO. Noah had read about her appointment in the employee newsletter, the first woman to head Mountain Air, brought in from a larger carrier to modernize operations and improve reliability. According to the article, she was spending Christmas week personally observing operations to understand the challenges facing the airline. "It's complicated, Miss Hale," the mechanic replied, his tone respectful but strained. "We've got what looks like a cascade failure in the flight management system. Multiple computers showing fault codes, but the diagnostics aren't making sense. It's like the system is trying to boot up, but can't complete the initialization sequence." Victoria studied the diagnostic tablet the mechanic handed her. Even from a distance, Noah could see her frown deepening as she scrolled through the error codes. "How long to get a replacement FMS unit?" "That's just it, we don't think it's the hardware. All the individual components test good. It's something in the software integration, but we can't isolate it. Could be a corrupted database, could be a timing issue between modules, this kind of problem." The mechanic spread his hands helplessly. "It's above our pay grade." Noah felt his chest tighten. He'd seen this exact failure pattern before, during his contractor days working on military aircraft. The symptoms pointed to a specific type of software conflict that occurred when multiple systems tried to access the same data bus simultaneously during startup. The fix was actually straightforward, a manual reset of the bus priorities, followed by a staged reinitialization of the flight management modules. But he was baggage handling, not aircraft maintenance. Speaking up would create exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 12 years avoiding. Victoria was checking her phone, probably calculating the cascade effects of this delay. "How many passengers?" 137. "About half are connections to smaller cities. If we can't get this flight out today, most of them won't make it home until the day after Christmas." The weight of that information settled over the gate area, like a cloud. Noah looked at the faces around him, the crying infant, the elderly couple holding hands and trying to stay patient, the military servicemen in dress blues who'd probably burned, leave time to get home for the holiday. "There has to be something we can do," Victoria said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd built a career on solving problems. "What about calling in a specialist from maintenance control?" "It's Christmas Eve, ma'am. The senior avionics guys are either working other emergencies or they're with their families. We could try to get someone here by tonight, but..." The mechanic's expression said what he couldn't voice, that tonight would be too late for any meaningful solution. Noah found himself stepping closer to the conversation, drawn by an instinct he thought he'd buried. The diagnostic tablet in Victoria's hands was displaying exactly the error codes he'd expected to see. Bus fault 42, initialization timeout, FMS, database corruption. It was a textbook case of timing conflict, probably triggered by a recent software update that hadn't accounted for the specific hardware configuration of this particular aircraft. "Excuse me," the words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Victoria and the mechanic turned toward him, taking in his orange safety vest and baggage handling credentials. Their expressions shifted from hope to polite dismissal in the space of a heartbeat. "Sir, "If you need assistance with rebooking," Victoria began, "I can fix that plane." The words hung in the recycled air of the terminal like a challenge. Noah felt every eye in the gate area turn toward him, passengers, crew members, maintenance personnel. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized there was no taking the statement back. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry?" "The flight management system. You've got a bus priority conflict causing a cascade initialization failure. It's not hardware, it's a software timing issue. I can fix it." The lead mechanic's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "Sir, with all due respect, your baggage handling. This is complex avionics troubleshooting that requires certification on Honeywell FMS systems, experience with CRJ 700 electrical architecture, and an understanding of how software modules interact during startup sequences." Noah's voice remained steady, despite the tremor he felt inside. "I have all of that." A murmur rippled through the assembled passengers. Someone in the back called out, "Let him try." Others began to nod and voice agreement. The businessman who'd been complaining earlier stepped forward. "Look, I don't care if he's the janitor. If this guy can get us to Phoenix today, I say we listen to him." Victoria studied Noah with new attention, her executive instincts clearly engaged. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "What's your background?" Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest as he drew a deep breath. "Air Force avionics. Contractor work on military FMS systems. 3 years of aerospace engineering before." He glanced toward the employee area where Matteo was probably doing homework. "Before life got complicated." The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Victoria looked from Noah to the diagnostic tablet, then to the mechanic, who was shaking his head with barely concealed skepticism. "Tom, how long would it take to get an outside specialist here?" "Minimum 6 hours, assuming we can find someone willing to come in on Christmas Eve." Victoria checked her watch, then looked back at Noah. "And you think you can fix this? How quickly?" "Give me 15 minutes with the aircraft systems. If I can't isolate the problem in that time, you haven't lost anything but a quarter hour." "Miss Hale," the mechanic interrupted, "this is highly irregular. Union protocols require that all aircraft maintenance be performed by certified." "I'm not touching any hardware," Noah said quickly. "This is software troubleshooting, system resets and reinitialization sequences. If I'm wrong about the diagnosis, nothing I do will make the problem worse." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between the stranded passengers and the grounded aircraft. Noah could almost see her calculating risks, the potential embarrassment of trusting a baggage handler against the certainty of disappointing 137 passengers on Christmas Eve. "What do you need?" she asked finally. The mechanic's jaw dropped. "Ms. Hale, I have to strongly advise—" "Tom, we've been working this problem for 3 hours with no progress." "Mr. Calderon. Noah Calderon. Mr. Calderon seems to understand the specific symptoms we're seeing. Given the circumstances, I think 15 minutes is a reasonable risk." Noah felt his hands start to shake slightly as the reality of the situation hit him. He was about to work on aircraft systems for the first time in over a decade, in front of an audience that included his new CEO and 137 stranded passengers. If he was wrong about the diagnosis, his credibility would be destroyed. If he was right but couldn't execute the fix, the result would be the same. But somewhere in the gate area, a child was crying because Christmas had been disrupted by a problem Noah understood completely. And in his pocket, his father's challenge coin seemed to pulse with the weight of knowledge that demanded to be used. "I'll need access to the flight management computer interface and about 10 minutes of quiet to work through the reset sequence," Noah said, "and maybe someone to document what I'm doing, in case it needs to be repeated." Victoria smiled for the first time since Noah had seen her. "Tom, please escort Mr. Calderon to the aircraft. And Tom, get someone to video the procedure. If this works, we're going to want to understand exactly what he did." As Noah walked across the tarmac toward the CRJ 700, he could feel the weight of 137 sets of eyes following his progress. The diagnostic tablet in his hands felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a language he'd once spoken fluently but hadn't practiced in years. The challenge coin pressed against his chest, with each step carrying the accumulated weight of 12 years of roads not taken and expertise left unused. But for the first time in over a decade, Noah Calderon was walking toward an aircraft not to load baggage or push back from the gate, but to do what he'd always been meant to do. Fix the problem. Get people home. Make the machines sing their proper songs. The aircraft's cabin felt like stepping into a time machine. Noah hadn't been inside a cockpit since his contractor days, but the familiar layout of switches, displays, and system panels triggered muscle memory he'd thought was lost. The captain, a graying man, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible emergency, watched with professional curiosity as Noah settled into the jump seat behind the center console. "I'm Captain Richards," the pilot said. "My first officer, Sarah Chen. We've been cycling through the startup sequence for the past hour with no luck." Noah nodded, accepting the diagnostic tablet from the mechanic. The screen displayed a cascade of error codes that would have looked like hieroglyphics to most people but told Noah a clear story. When did the problem first manifest? "During our pre-flight systems check," First Officer Chen replied. "Everything powered up normally, but the flight management system wouldn't complete initialization. We've tried multiple restart sequences, even pulled the circuit breakers and reset everything." "Classic timing conflict," Noah murmured, scrolling through the error log. "The FMS is trying to sync with the air data computer and the navigation database simultaneously, but there's a priority dispute in the data bus architecture." He looked up to find 3 pairs of eyes staring at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Through the cockpit window, he could see Victoria Hale standing in the jetway, arms crossed, watching his every move. Beyond her, passengers pressed against the terminal windows, their collective anxiety almost palpable. "Walk me through exactly what happens during startup," Noah said, his fingers already moving across the diagnostic interface with growing confidence. For the next 10 minutes, Noah methodically worked through the system architecture, isolating each component's initialization sequence and identifying the conflict points. His movements became more fluid as forgotten skills resurged, years of theoretical knowledge melding with hands-on experience in a way that felt both natural and revelatory. "There," he said finally, pointing to a specific line in the diagnostic code. "Bus priority table corrupted during the last software update. The FMS and ADCS are trying to claim the same data pathway simultaneously. Watch this." Noah's fingers danced across the interface, manually resetting the bus priorities, and then initiating a staged restart sequence, FMS first, followed by navigation systems, then air data computers in precise 15-second intervals. The cockpit displays flickered, went dark, then began illuminating in sequence as each system came online cleanly. "Flight Management System initialization complete," the FMS announced in its synthetic voice. "Database current, navigation ready." Captain Richards stared at his now functional displays with something approaching awe. "How did you know to do that?" "Experience with similar systems," Noah replied, but his heart was hammering with the rush of solving a complex technical problem. The bus architecture in military aircraft has the same vulnerability. Once you've seen the failure pattern, the fix becomes obvious. First Officer Chen was already running through her checklist, confirming that all systems were responding normally. "Everything looks good. We're showing normal function across all flight management interfaces." The cockpit door opened, and Victoria Hale appeared with the lead mechanic in tow. "Status report?" "Problem resolved," Captain Richards said, still shaking his head in amazement. "Mr. Calderon identified a software conflict and manually corrected the bus priority settings. We're ready for departure." Victoria's expression was unreadable as she studied the now functional displays. "How long did that take?" Noah checked his watch. 12 minutes. 12 minutes to solve a problem that stumped our maintenance team for 3 hours. Victoria's voice carried a note of something surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Mr. Calderon, I think we need to talk. An hour later, Noah found himself in Victoria's temporary office, actually, a converted conference room in the airport's administrative wing. The space was spartanly furnished with a folding table, 2 chairs, and a laptop computer that looked like it had traveled extensively. Victoria sat across from him, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands and an expression of focused attention on her face. "Tell me about your background," she said without preamble. Noah had been dreading this conversation since the moment the FMS came back online. Air Force, like I said, avionics specialist with the 355th Aircraft Maintenance Squadron. Worked primarily on F-16s and A-10s. After my service, I did contractor work for various aerospace companies, Boeing, Lockheed, some smaller firms. And you ended up handling baggage, how? The question hit like a physical blow, forcing Noah to confront the series of compromises that had led him here. Life happened. My son was born, my marriage fell apart, and I needed stable work that would let me be present for him. Baggage handling provided that stability. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying him with the calculating gaze of someone who made career-defining decisions daily. "What's your current technical certification status?" "Expired." The admission felt like confessing to a crime. "I let my FAA certifications lapse about 8 years ago. Couldn't justify the renewal costs when I wasn't working in the field." "But your knowledge clearly hasn't lapsed." "Knowledge doesn't expire. Experience doesn't either, apparently." Noah fingered the temporary contractor badge that security had issued him for the aircraft access. The plastic felt substantial in his hands, like a tangible connection to the professional world he'd abandoned. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup in a rhythm that suggested rapid mental calculation. "Noah, may I call you Noah? I'm going to be direct with you. Mountain Air is facing some significant challenges." She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. The screen displayed a series of charts and graphs that painted a picture of an airline in crisis. On-time performance was declining, maintenance costs were rising, and customer satisfaction scores were dropping toward industry-low levels. "We've had 17 mechanical delays in the past month alone," Victoria continued. "Most of them involving complex systems issues that our current maintenance teams struggle to diagnose efficiently. Problems that should take 30 minutes are taking 3 hours. Problems that should cost hundreds of dollars are costing thousands." Noah studied the data, his engineer's mind automatically looking for patterns and root causes. "Looks like you have a systemic training issue. Modern aircraft systems are becoming more integrated and software-dependent, but many maintenance teams are still approaching problems with hardware-focused thinking." "Exactly." Victoria's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd found a kindred, analytical spirit. "We need people who understand both the legacy mechanical systems and the modern software integration, people who can bridge that gap." Noah felt a familiar stirring in his chest, excitement of a complex problem that demanded innovative solutions. But reality quickly reasserted itself. "That sounds like a fascinating challenge, but I'm not sure how it relates to me. I'm baggage handling, remember? What if you weren't?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Noah wasn't sure he was ready to consider. "Ms. Hale." "Victoria." "Victoria, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in me, but I have responsibilities. My son depends on the stability of my current position. I can't just—" "I'm not asking you to make any permanent decisions," Victoria interrupted, "but I have an immediate problem that your skills could help solve, and it might benefit both of us." She turned the laptop back toward herself and pulled up another set of data. "We're facing a potential fleet-wide software issue, similar to what you just fixed, but affecting multiple aircraft types across our entire operation. Our IT department thinks it's related to a recent update to our flight management software, but they can't isolate the specific problem." Noah leaned forward despite himself. "How widespread?" 12 aircraft showing intermittent symptoms over the past week. If the pattern continues, we could be looking at significant operational disruptions right in the middle of peak holiday travel." The FAA is already asking questions about our reliability metrics. The implications were staggering. A fleet-wide grounding during the holidays would strand thousands of passengers and potentially bankrupt a regional airline already operating on thin margins. Noah found himself mentally cataloguing the possible failure modes and diagnostic approaches before catching himself. "What exactly are you proposing?" Victoria closed the laptop and leaned forward, her expression shifting to the focused intensity of someone making a critical business decision. "A consulting contract. 24 hours to help us identify and resolve the fleet issue. You'd work directly with our senior maintenance team and have full access to aircraft systems and diagnostic data." 24 hours? Noah's mind raced through the logistics. That would mean working through Christmas Day. I understand that's a significant ask. But Noah, if we can't solve this problem quickly, we're looking at the possibility of grounding our entire fleet. That would mean thousands of passengers stranded during the holidays and dozens of employees losing their jobs in the new year. Noah thought about Matteo, probably still doing homework in the employee break area, unaware that his father's world was shifting beneath his feet. The custody arrangement with Elena depended on stability, predictability, and Noah's ability to demonstrate that he could provide a secure environment for their son. But he also thought about the faces in Gate B-17th crying infant, the military serviceman, the elderly couple holding hands and hoping to make it home for Christmas. How many similar faces would be disappointed if Mountain Air's fleet went down? What would the compensation be? $50,000. Noah nearly choked on his coffee. 50,000? For one day of work? For potentially saving the company. And Noah, there's something else you should know. Victoria's expression grew serious. If this consulting arrangement works out, if you can help us resolve the fleet issue, I'd like to discuss a permanent position, Chief Technical Officer, reporting directly to me. Full benefits, competitive salary, and the kind of technical challenges that would make use of everything you know. The temporary contractor badge in Noah's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Chief Technical Officer. A title that represented everything he'd walked away from 12 years ago, everything he'd convinced himself he didn't want anymore. "I need to think about this," Noah said, his voice barely steady. "Of course. But Noah, I need an answer by tomorrow morning. Christmas Day or not, we can't afford to wait much longer." As Noah walked back through the terminal toward the employee break area, his mind churned with possibilities and complications. The badge in his pocket felt like a tangible symbol of a crossroads-zone path, leading back to the stable, predictable life he'd built around Matteo's needs. The other toward the kind of professional challenge he'd thought was permanently beyond his reach. Matteo looked up from his homework as Noah approached, his perceptive eyes immediately noting his father's troubled expression. "Dad, you look different. Did something happen?" Noah settled into the chair across from his son, struggling to find words for a conversation he'd never expected to have. "Something unexpected came up at work today. An opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "The kind that could change things for us, maybe make things better, maybe make them more complicated." Matteo closed his workbook and studied his father with the unsettling perception that had become familiar over the years. "It's about fixing airplanes, isn't it?" "How did you—" "You have that look again, but different this time, less sad." Noah reached across the table and took his son's hand. "Mijo, what would you think if Dad had a chance to go back to working on airplanes? It would mean some changes, some uncertainty, but it might also mean better opportunities for both of us." Matteo was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the seriousness of a child who'd learned early that life required difficult choices. "Would you be happier?" he asked finally. The question cut straight to the heart of everything Noah had been avoiding for 12 years. Would he be happier? Or had he become so comfortable with compromise that he'd forgotten what fulfillment felt like? "I think I might be," Noah admitted, "but only if it doesn't hurt what we have together. You're still the most important thing in my life." "Then maybe you should try," Matteo said, with the simple wisdom that only children possess. Grandpa always said you were meant to fix airplanes. Maybe it's time to listen to him." As Noah looked at his son, this remarkable child, who'd shaped every decision of the past decade, he felt the temporary contractor badge pressing against his chest like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and the possibility of reclaiming a piece of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. But tonight, he was still a baggage handler with a son to raise and a life built on careful compromises. The question was whether he had the courage to risk everything safe and predictable for the chance to soar again. Christmas morning arrived, grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made airport operations feel even more industrial than usual. Noah stood in his small kitchen, staring at his phone and the text message from Victoria that had arrived at 6 a.m. "Decision time. Fleet showing 3 more incidents overnight. Need you here by 8, if you're in." Matteo sat at their small dining table, quietly eating cereal, while watching his father wrestle with a choice that would reshape their lives. The boy had inherited his father's ability to read situations, and the tension in the apartment was as thick as the coffee Noah wasn't drinking. "You're scared," Matteo observed, not looking up from his bowl. "Terrified," Noah admitted. There was no point in hiding his uncertainty from a child who saw through pretense like it was glass. "Mom called last night." Noah's spoon clinked against his mug. Elena rarely called on holidays, preferring to maintain the carefully negotiated boundaries of their shared custody arrangement. "What did she say?" "She heard about you fixing the airplane. It's on the news." Matteo pulled out his phony a basic model Noah had reluctantly provided for safety. Reason San showed his father a local news website. The headline read, "Baggage Handler Saves Christmas Flight with Quick Thinking." The article was brief but accurate, describing how an airport employee had diagnosed and resolved a complex technical problem that had stumped certified mechanics. Noah's name was mentioned, along with his background as a former Air Force avionics specialist. The piece concluded with speculation about whether this represented a broader skill gap in the aviation maintenance industry. "Mom said she was proud of you." The words hit Noah like a physical blow. Elena had been many things during their marriage's abortive. Frustrated, understanding, resentful, but proud hadn't been one of them toward the end. She'd watched him choose financial security over professional fulfillment, stability over ambition, and had grown increasingly distant as he'd settled into what she called playing it safe. She also said that if you want to try something new, she won't fight you in court about it. Noah sat down hard in the chair across from his son. "She said that?" "She said that maybe it was time for you to stop being afraid of your own talents." The handwritten diagnostic notes in Matteo's school notebook lay open beside his serial bold-crude sketches of aircraft systems that Noah had drawn while helping with a science project about flight. They'd used the notebook because Noah didn't have proper engineering paper at home, hadn't needed it for years. But the diagrams were precise, detailed, showing the interconnections between hydraulic, electrical, and flight control systems with the clarity of someone who understood machines at their deepest level. "Are you going to take the job?" Matteo asked. "It's not exactly a job. It's a consulting contract, one day to help solve a technical problem." After that, Noah spread his hands, unsure how to explain the complexity of the situation to a 10-year-old. But it could become a job. It could, or it could be a disaster that ruins everything stable we've built. Matteo pushed his notebook toward his father, pointing to one of the sketches, a cross-section of a turbofan engine with carefully labeled components. "You drew this without looking anything up. You knew where every part went, how everything connected. That's not something you can just stop being good at." At 7:30 a.m., Noah made the call. "Victoria, it's Noah Calderon. I'm in." 2 hours later, Noah found himself in Mountain Air's primary maintenance hangar, surrounded by the organized chaos of an airline trying to diagnose a fleet-wide technical crisis. 3 aircraft sat in various states of disassembly, their engine cowlings open and diagnostic equipment scattered around them like electronic tumbleweeds. The senior maintenance supervisor, a gruff man named Frank Morrison, greeted Noah with barely concealed hostility. "So you're the miracle worker who's going to solve our problems in one day?" "I'm the guy who's going to try," Noah replied evenly. "Show me what you've got." For the next hour, Frank walked Noah through the symptoms affecting the fleet. The problems were inconsistent, seemingly random, and growing more frequent. Some aircraft experienced flight management system glitches, similar to yesterday's incident. Others showed anomalies in autopilot engagement, navigation, database corruption, or communication system dropouts. "It's like the aircraft are developing Alzheimer's," Frank said, his frustration evident. "Systems that worked perfectly yesterday suddenly can't remember their basic functions." Noah studied the diagnostic reports, looking for patterns that might not be obvious to technicians focused on individual aircraft. The handwritten notes in Matteo's notebook had reminded him of something important sometimes. The most complex problems had elegantly simple solutions, if you could see the underlying architecture clearly. "When did the problems start?" he asked. "About 10 days ago, right after we implemented the latest software update from the manufacturer." "And the update was supposed to do what?" Frank consulted his paperwork. "Improve fuel efficiency calculations and enhance navigation accuracy. Routine stuff. We've done dozens of these updates over the years." Noah nodded, but his engineer's instincts were already suggesting a different narrative. "Can you show me the update documentation?" What Frank produced was a stack of technical papers thick enough to stop a bullet, filled with the kind of dense engineering language that made most people's eyes glaze over. But Noah read through the documentation with the focused intensity of someone who spoke this particular dialect fluently. After 30 minutes, he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, pointing to a specific section in the update notes. "Bus timing modifications to improve system response times." They adjusted the data flow priorities without accounting for aircraft-specific hardware variations. Frank squinted at the technical language. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning the update assumes all aircraft in the fleet have identical hardware configurations. But older aircraft have different data bus architectures than newer ones. The update works fine on new planes, but creates timing conflicts on older systems." "So, we need to roll back the update?" "Not necessarily. The improvements are actually valuable. They just need to be implemented differently for different aircraft configurations." Noah was already mentally designing a solution. His long-dormant engineering skills, engaging with the problem like puzzle pieces, clicking into place. "How long would that take?" Noah looked around the hangar at the 3 aircraft awaiting diagnosis. "Give me access to your fleet configuration database, and about 6 hours. I can create aircraft-specific timing parameters that will allow the update to work correctly across your entire fleet." Frank's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. "You can really do that?" "I can really do that." But as Noah settled in at a workstation with access to Mountain Air's technical systems, he realized that solving the technical problem was only the beginning of his challenges. Word of his presence in the maintenance hangar had spread quickly through the airport, and not everyone was pleased with an outsider being brought in to address critical safety systems. The union representative, a stern woman named Carol Washington, appeared at his workstation an hour into his analysis. "Mr. Calderon, I need to discuss some concerns with your presence here." Noah looked up from the computer screen where he'd been mapping bus timing sequences for different aircraft configurations. "What concerns?" "You're not a certified Mountain Air employee. You don't have current FAA maintenance certifications. And you're performing work that should be done by our qualified technicians." "I'm not performing maintenance," Noah replied carefully. "I'm analyzing software configurations and creating timing parameters. It's essentially programming work. Work that affects flight safety systems. Work that requires proper certification and oversight." Noah understood Carol's position. She was protecting her members' jobs and ensuring safety protocols were followed. But he also understood that bureaucratic niceties wouldn't help if Mountain Air's entire fleet was grounded. "Carol, right?" he said, standing to face her directly. I appreciate your concerns about protocol, but right now, your airline has 12 aircraft showing symptoms of a potentially dangerous software conflict. If we can't resolve this quickly, the FAA might ground the entire fleet as a safety precaution. That's exactly why this work should be done by certified professionals following established procedures. Your certified professionals have been working on this for 10 days with no progress, Noah pointed out. Sometimes you need someone with a different perspective. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, along with Frank Morrison and two other managers Noah didn't recognize. Victoria's expression was tense, and she carried herself with the controlled urgency of someone dealing with a crisis. "Status report," she said, without preamble. "I've identified the root cause," Noah replied. "Software update created timing conflicts on older aircraft. I'm developing aircraft-specific parameters that should resolve the issue across the fleet." "How confident are you in this solution?" "Very confident. The technical approach is sound, and I've seen similar fixes work on military systems with comparable architecture." Victoria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "We have a complication. The FAA received multiple reports about our reliability issues overnight. They're sending an inspector tomorrow to review our maintenance procedures and potentially impose operational restrictions." The implications hit Noah like a cold wave. An FAA investigation would scrutinize every aspect of Mountain Air's operations, including any irregular maintenance procedures or unauthorized personnel working on safety systems. His presence in the hangar, while technically legal as a contractor, might be viewed unfavorably by federal regulators focused on proper certification and protocol compliance. "There's more," Victoria continued. "Our insurance company is asking questions about the fleet issues. If they determine that we're operating aircraft with known software problems, they might suspend coverage." Noah looked around the hangar at the complex machinery that represented millions of dollars in assets and thousands of jobs. The solution to their technical problem was within reach. He could probably have the aircraft-specific timing parameters ready by evening. But the regulatory and legal complications were mounting faster than he could address them. "What do you need from me?" he asked Victoria. "Finish the technical solution as quickly as possible. Frank will coordinate testing on one aircraft to validate your approach. If it works, we'll implement it across the fleet before the FAA inspector arrives." Carol Washington stepped forward. "Ms. Hale, I have to formally object to this approach. Having uncertified personnel perform critical system modifications violates both union agreements and federal regulations." "Carol, I understand your position," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to navigating complex organizational dynamics. "But Mr. Calderon isn't performing maintenance. He's providing technical consulting on software configuration. Any actual system modifications will be performed by your certified technicians following his specifications." It was a careful distinction, but one that Noah recognized as legally sound. He would develop the solution. The certified mechanics would implement it. The arrangement satisfied regulatory requirements while still allowing his expertise to address the technical problem. "I need something in writing documenting that arrangement," Carol said, "and I want one of our senior technicians working with Mr. Calderon throughout the process." "Agreed," Victoria said. "Frank, assign your best avionics specialist to work with Noah. Make sure everything is properly documented and follows established procedures." Frank nodded and walked toward a workstation where a woman in coveralls was reviewing diagnostic printouts. "Sarah, I need you over here." Sarah Chen turned out to be Frank's daughter, a certified avionics technician with 15 years of experience and the same methodical approach to problem-solving that Noah had seen in her father. She greeted Noah with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. "So you're the guy who fixed yesterday's FMS problem," she said, settling at the workstation beside him. "Guilty as charged. And now you think you can solve our fleet-wide issues in one day. I think I can identify the technical solution. Implementing it across 12 aircraft will require a team effort." Sarah studied the diagnostic data Noah had compiled, her expression gradually shifting from skepticism to interest. "You're saying the software update is causing bus timing conflicts on older aircraft?" "Exactly. The update assumes uniform hardware configurations, but your fleet has 3 different avionics architectures spanning 15 years of aircraft evolution." "That actually makes sense," Sarah admitted. "We've noticed that the newer 700 series aircraft aren't showing problems, while the older 200s and 500s are having multiple issues." For the next 2 hours, Noah and Sarah worked together to map the specific timing requirements for each aircraft configuration. The collaboration was surprisingly smooth. Sarah's practical knowledge of Mountain Air's specific systems complemented Noah's theoretical understanding of the underlying software architecture. As they worked, Noah found himself remembering why he'd fallen in love with aviation technology in the first place. The elegant complexity of modern aircraft systems, the way multiple computers and sensors work together to enable flight, the satisfaction of diagnosing and solving problems that kept people connected across vast distances, it all felt like returning to a language he'd once spoken fluently. "Got it," Sarah said finally, reviewing the timing parameters Noah had calculated for the 200 series aircraft. "These settings should eliminate the bus conflicts while preserving the efficiency improvements from the update." "Ready to test?" Sarah looked at her father, who had been monitoring their progress with growing optimism. Frank nodded toward the nearest aircrafter CRJ-200 that had been showing intermittent FMS problems for the past week. "Let's see if your theory works in practice." The next hour passed in a blur of technical precision and growing excitement. Sarah implemented Noah's timing parameters while he monitored system responses, and Frank documented every step of the process. The aircraft's computers came online cleanly, with none of the initialization errors that had plagued the fleet for the past 10 days. "All systems showing normal operation," Sarah reported, running through a comprehensive diagnostic sequence. "Navigation, communication, flight management, everything's responding correctly." Frank called Victoria with the news, and within minutes the maintenance hangar was buzzing with activity as additional aircraft were prepared for the updated timing parameters. Noah found himself at the center of organized chaos, fielding questions from technicians and managers, while Sarah led teams through the implementation process. But even as the technical solution proved successful, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. The temporary contractor badge in his pocket felt substantial, but also fragile, a tenuous connection to a world he'd walked away from years ago. His phone buzzed with a text from Matteo. "How's it going? Mom's making Christmas dinner if you want to come by later." The message hit Noah with unexpected emotion. Elena was extending an olive branch, acknowledging his professional achievement in a way she hadn't done in years. But it also reminded him of the life he'd built outside the hangar, quiet, stable, centered around his son's needs rather than his own ambitions. Second thoughts? Victoria appeared at his elbow, having observed his momentary distraction. "Just thinking about the implications," Noah replied. "This consulting work, the potential permanent position it, would change everything for my son and me." "Change how?" Noah gestured around the hangar at the controlled chaos of aircraft maintenance. "This world requires complete commitment. Long hours, travel, constant learning to keep up with evolving technology. I walked away from it once because I couldn't balance professional demands with being the father Matteo needed. And now he's older, more independent, but he's also approaching the teenage years, when he'll need stability and consistency more than ever. I'm not sure I can risk disrupting what we've built together." Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah's team successfully update another aircraft's timing parameters. "Noah, can I share something personal?" He nodded. "I spent 10 years climbing the corporate ladder at a major airline, working 80-hour weeks and missing most of my daughter's childhood. I told myself I was building a better future for our family, but really, I was just pursuing my own ambitions and using her welfare as justification." Victoria's expression grew distant. By the time I realized what I'd sacrificed, she was 16 and barely knew me. We're still rebuilding that relationship. "So you think I should stick with baggage handling?" I think you should be honest about your motivations. Are you considering this opportunity because it would make you happy, or because you think it would be better for Matteo? Because, in my experience, children benefit more from having parents who are fulfilled and engaged than from having parents who are safely miserable. Before Noah could respond, Frank Morrison approached with news that would complicate everything further. Noah, we just got word from the FAA inspector. She's arriving tonight instead of tomorrow. Wants to review all maintenance activities performed in the past 48 hours, including any consulting work done by outside contractors. The temporary contractor badge in Noah's pocket suddenly felt like evidence in a criminal investigation. Everything he'd accomplished in the past day would be scrutinized by federal regulators focused on proper certification and protocol compliance. What does that mean for the fleet modifications? Noah asked. It means we need to have everything documented perfectly before she arrives, Frank replied. Every timing parameter change, every diagnostic test, every procedural step. If there are any irregularities, she could ground the entire fleet pending a full investigation. As evening approached and the maintenance teams worked feverishly to complete the fleet updates, Noah realized that his 24-hour consulting contract had evolved into something much larger and more complex. The technical problem was solved, but the regulatory, legal, and personal implications were just beginning to unfold. The handwritten diagnostic notes in Matteo's notebook had started this journey, but where it would end remained entirely uncertain. The FAA inspector arrived at 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, carrying a briefcase that looked substantial enough to contain the regulatory fate of Mountain Air's entire operation. Inspector Janet Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the methodical demeanor of someone who had built a career on finding problems that others preferred to overlook. Noah watched from the maintenance office as Victoria greeted the inspector at the hangar entrance, their conversation too distant to hear but clearly tense. Frank Morrison stood nearby with a stack of documentation thick enough to serve as a phone book, while Sarah Chen made final checks on the aircraft systems they'd updated throughout the day. Nervous? Carol Washington appeared beside Noah, her earlier hostility replaced by something approaching concern. Terrified, Noah admitted. If Inspector Rodriguez determines that our consulting arrangement violated federal regulations, it won't just affect Mountain Air. It could impact my ability to work in aviation anywhere. Maybe you should have thought about that before working on safety systems without proper certification. Maybe, Noah agreed, but 12 aircraft with software problems would have been a bigger safety issue than one uncertified consultant trying to help solve them. Carol studied him with the appraising look of someone reconsidering her initial judgment. You really believe you did the right thing? I believe I prevented a worse problem. Whether the FAA sees it that way remains to be determined. Inspector Rodriguez spent the next 2 hours reviewing every piece of documentation Frank's team had prepared. She examined the original software update files, the diagnostic reports showing fleet-wide problems, Noah's timing parameter calculations, and the step-by-step implementation records. Her expression remained carefully neutral throughout the process, offering no hints about her conclusions. Noah found himself relegated to observer status, watching from the maintenance office while his professional fate was decided by conversations he couldn't hear. The encrypted USB drive hidden in the maintenance records, which Frank had shown him earlier, contained additional information about the software problems, but Noah hadn't had time to examine its contents thoroughly. Mr. Calderon? Inspector Rodriguez appeared in the office doorway, her tone giving nothing away. I'd like to speak with you. The conversation took place in a small conference room adjacent to the hangar, with Victoria and Frank present as witnesses. Inspector Rodriguez opened a recorder and stated the time, date, and participants for the record. Mr. Calderon, please describe your role in the aircraft modifications performed over the past 24 hours. Noah had rehearsed this moment mentally, knowing that his words would be scrutinized for any hint of regulatory violation. I served as a technical consultant, analyzing software timing conflicts and developing configuration parameters to resolve fleet-wide system problems. All actual aircraft modifications were performed by certified mountain air technicians following established procedures. And your qualifications for this consulting work? Former Air Force avionics specialist with experience on military flight management systems, previous contractor work with commercial aerospace manufacturers on similar technical issues. Inspector Rodriguez made notes without comment. Are you currently certified to perform maintenance on commercial aircraft? No, ma'am. My FAA certifications expired several years ago when I left the aviation industry. Yet you felt qualified to develop solutions for safety, critical aircraft systems. The question carried dangerous implications. Noah chose his words carefully. I felt qualified to analyze software architecture and identify timing conflicts. The actual implementation was performed by certified personnel who verified my analysis before making any system modifications. Walk me through your diagnostic process. For the next hour, Noah explained his analysis of the fleet problems, from identifying the root cause in the software update to developing aircraft-specific timing parameters. Inspector Rodriguez asked detailed questions about his methodology, his assumptions, and his confidence in the solutions he'd proposed. Have you examined all the maintenance records for the affected aircraft? She asked. I've reviewed the records Frank Morrison provided, focusing on the symptoms related to the software conflicts. All the records? Something in her tone suggested deeper implications. Noah glanced at Frank, who looked uncomfortable. I believe so. Are there additional records I should have seen? Inspector Rodriguez exchanged a look with Victoria before responding. Mr. Morrison, please provide Mr. Calderon with access to the complete maintenance database, including the files you've been keeping separately. Frank's face flushed. Inspector, those files contain preliminary investigations that haven't been verified. Mr. Morrison, either you provide complete access to your maintenance records, or I suspend your operation until I can conduct a full audit of your documentation practices. 20 minutes later, Noah found himself staring at the contents of the encrypted USB drive with growing alarm. The hidden files contained maintenance reports dating back 18 months, documenting a pattern of software-related problems that went far beyond the recent fleet issues. According to the records, Mountain Air had experienced sporadic FMS failures, navigation anomalies, and communication system glitches for over a year. The problems had been treated as isolated incidents, with individual aircraft receiving component replacements and software reinstalls without anyone recognizing the broader pattern. Why wasn't this information included in the original analysis? Noah asked Frank. Because it's mostly speculation and preliminary findings, Frank replied defensively. We couldn't prove a connection between the older incidents and the recent problems. But Noah could see the connections clearly now, studying the data with the pattern recognition skills his father had taught him decades ago. The older problems showed the same underlying signatures as the recent fleet issues, suggesting that the software conflicts had been building gradually over time. More disturbing was the discovery that several of the older incidents had involved near-miss situations where navigation errors or communication failures had created potentially dangerous conditions that were resolved only by pilot intervention. Inspector Rodriguez, Noah said, his voice tight with concern. I think we have a bigger problem than anyone realized. What Noah had uncovered suggested that the recent software update hadn't created the timing conflicts, it had simply made them more frequent and obvious. The underlying problems had been present for months, creating intermittent safety issues that hadn't been recognized as part of a systemic pattern. How much bigger? Inspector Rodriguez asked. Noah studied the maintenance records, mentally mapping the progression of problems across the fleet. Based on this data, I'd estimate that Mountain Air has been operating with compromised flight management systems for at least 18 months. The recent update didn't cause the problems it revealed them. Victoria's face went pale. What are you saying? I'm saying that your airline has been experiencing systematic software failures that created potential safety risks. The failures were infrequent enough to be dismissed as random malfunctions, but consistent enough to represent a pattern that should have been investigated. Inspector Rodriguez closed her recorder with a decisive click. "Ms. Hale, I'm imposing immediate operational restrictions on Mountain Air, pending a comprehensive investigation of your maintenance practices and safety management systems." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Operational restrictions meant that Mountain Air's aircraft would be grounded until the FAA completed its investigation, a process that could take weeks or months. For a regional airline, already operating on thin margins, such restrictions would be financially catastrophic. "Inspector, surely we can work out some arrangement that allows limited operations while addressing your concerns," Victoria said, her executive composure beginning to crack. "The scope of the safety issues described by Mr. Calderon requires a thorough investigation. I cannot allow aircraft to continue operating when there may be systematic problems affecting flight safety systems." Noah felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. His analysis had been thorough and accurate, but it had also revealed problems that would destroy the airline he'd been trying to help. "There might be another approach," he said quietly. Inspector Rodriguez turned toward him. "Explain. Give me 48 hours to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the entire fleet. If I can identify all affected aircraft and develop verified solutions for each system configuration, would you consider allowing limited operations under enhanced monitoring?" "Mr. Calderon, you just told us that you've identified systematic safety problems dating back 18 months. Why would I allow continued operations based on analysis from someone without current certification?" Noah looked around the room at faces that reflected various degrees of hope, skepticism, and desperation. Victoria's expression showed the strain of someone watching her company collapse in real time. Frank looked like a man who'd spent his career building something that was about to be destroyed by problems he hadn't recognized. Because the alternative is grounding an entire airline 3 days after Christmas, stranding thousands of passengers and putting hundreds of people out of work, Noah replied. "And because I might be the only person available who has both the technical expertise to solve these problems and the motivation to do it quickly." Inspector Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, weighing regulatory caution against practical necessity. "What would your analysis involve?" "Complete review of maintenance records for all aircraft in the fleet. Comprehensive testing of flight management systems under various operational conditions. Development of aircraft-specific solutions that address both the recent problems and the underlying issues revealed in the historical data. In 48 hours? With the right team and unrestricted access to aircraft and systems, yes." Inspector Rodriguez looked at Victoria. "Ms. Hale, are you willing to accept Mr. Calderon's analysis as the basis for your continued operations? If it keeps our aircraft flying and our passengers safe, absolutely. Then I'll give you 48 hours. But Mr. Calderon, if your analysis is incomplete or inaccurate, the consequences will extend far beyond Mountain Air's operations. The FAA will hold you personally responsible for any safety issues that result from aircraft being returned to service based on your recommendations." As the meeting broke up and Inspector Rodriguez departed for her hotel, Noah found himself alone in the conference room with the encrypted USB drive and the growing realization that he'd just committed to the most complex technical challenge of his career. 48 hours to analyze 18 months of problems across a 12-aircraft fleet. 48 hours to develop solutions that would satisfy federal regulators focused on safety above all else. 48 hours to prove that a former baggage handler could indeed bridge the gap between complex technical problems and practical solutions. The challenge coin in his pocket seemed to pulse with the accumulated weight of his father's expectations and his son's faith in his abilities. But for the first time since this journey began, Noah wasn't sure that faith was justified. Outside the hangar, snow was beginning to fall again on the Colorado landscape, dusting the grounded aircraft with a thin layer of white that made them look fragile and earthbound. Soon, those aircraft would either return to the sky based on his analysis or remain grounded as monuments to problems he'd helped reveal but couldn't solve. The next 48 hours would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but Noah's own understanding of what he was truly capable of achieving. The next morning arrived with the kind of brittle clarity that follows a sleepless night. Noah sat in the employee break room at 5 a.m., surrounded by printouts of maintenance records and laptop computers displaying diagnostic data, while Matteo slept on a makeshift bed constructed from couch cushions and airline blankets. His son had insisted on staying at the airport through the night, claiming he wanted to help, but really understanding that his father needed the comfort of familiar presence during the most challenging work of his life. Elena had surprised them both by dropping off dinner and fresh clothes around midnight, staying long enough to see Noah's complete immersion in the technical analysis before quietly offering her support. "You look like you're drowning in paperwork," Victoria said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that smelled stronger than anything the vending machines could produce. 18 months of maintenance records across 12 aircraft, Noah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Every component replacement, every software update, every anomaly report. I'm looking for patterns that nobody else recognized because they were spread across time and different aircraft. Victoria settled into the chair across from him, careful not to disturb the carefully organized stacks of documentation. "What have you found?" Noah pulled out a hand-drawn timeline he'd constructed during the NITR complex chart, mapping aircraft tail numbers against maintenance events and reported problems. The issues started about 20 months ago, shortly after Mountain Air implemented a new maintenance tracking system. The software conflicts weren't caused by a recent update. They were caused by cumulative changes to aircraft configurations that nobody was tracking systematically. Meaning that each aircraft in your fleet has been modified slightly over time. Different software versions, different hardware components, different timing configurations. The modifications were all approved individually, but nobody looked at how they might interact with each other. Victoria studied the timeline, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "So, we've been flying aircraft with incompatible system configurations." "Not incompatible exactly, but suboptimal. The systems work most of the time, but under certain conditions, specific combinations of altitude, temperature, and workload, they create conflicts that manifest as the failures we've been seeing." Noah pointed to specific entries on his timeline. "Look at this pattern. Aircraft with older flight management systems show problems primarily during winter operations at high-altitude airports. Aircraft with newer systems show problems during heavy traffic conditions when multiple navigation systems are active simultaneously." That's remarkably specific. It's also completely predictable once you understand the underlying architecture. Noah felt the familiar excitement of solving complex puzzles, the same sensation he'd experienced as a child working alongside his father in the garage. The problems aren't random, they're the logical result of system configurations that were never designed to work together. Victoria was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. "If you're right, then we've been treating symptoms instead of causes for almost 2 years." "Exactly, and Inspector Rodriguez was correct to be concerned. Some of these configuration conflicts do represent potential safety risks." Noah pulled out another document, his father's old flight logbook, which he'd retrieved from home during a brief break around 2 a.m. The leather-bound book contained detailed notes about aircraft systems and maintenance procedures from Miguel Calderon's years as a test pilot. "My father died in a crash caused by a flight management system failure," Noah said quietly. "I never understood the technical details until last night." Victoria's expression shifted to one of careful attention. "What did you discover?" Noah opened the logbook to a page marked with a faded bookmark. He was flying a prototype aircraft with a new navigation system that hadn't been properly integrated with the existing autopilot software. The system worked perfectly during normal operations, but under specific stress conditions, it created a control conflict that the pilots couldn't resolve. "The same type of problem you're seeing in Mountain Air's fleet." The same underlying issue-incompatible system configurations that create unpredictable failures under stress conditions. Noah's voice carried the weight of 20-year-old grief, finally finding resolution. My father was investigating the system integration problems when he died. His notes describe exactly the kind of comprehensive analysis I'm doing now. Victoria reached across the table and touched Noah's hand briefly. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm grateful that his work is helping us prevent similar problems. Noah closed the logbook and returned his attention to the maintenance timeline. I think I can solve Mountain Air's technical problems, but there's something else you need to know. What? The systematic nature of these issues suggests they weren't accidental. Someone with detailed knowledge of aircraft systems would have had to deliberately introduce incompatible configurations across multiple aircraft over an extended period. Victoria's face went pale. You're suggesting sabotage. I'm suggesting that the maintenance records show patterns that are too consistent to be random. Either Mountain Air has been extraordinarily unlucky with component failures and software conflicts, or someone has been deliberately creating system vulnerabilities. Noah showed Victoria a specific section of his analysis, chart tracking component replacements across the fleet. Look at this pattern. Over the past 18 months, specific components have been replaced on multiple aircraft with versions that are technically compatible but create timing conflicts when combined with other system updates. Who would have access to make those kinds of modifications? Someone with maintenance authorization, detailed knowledge of aircraft systems, and access to parts inventory. Probably someone inside Mountain Air who understood how to create problems that would look like random failures. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, studying the documentation with the focused intensity of someone whose world was shifting beneath her feet. If you're right, then we're dealing with more than technical problems. We're dealing with deliberate sabotage aimed at destroying the airline. Or at destroying confidence in your leadership, Noah suggested. You're the new CEO. If the fleet problems get bad enough, the board might decide you're not the right person to lead the company. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious pattern in the data. Victoria stood and walked to the window overlooking the maintenance hangar, where crews were preparing aircraft for Noah's comprehensive testing program. What do you need to prove your theory? Access to personnel records for everyone with maintenance authorization. Detailed review of parts procurement and installation procedures. And about 12 more hours of analysis to map the specific system modifications. You'll have whatever you need. Noah looked at his sleeping son, curled up on the makeshift bed with the innocent trust of a child who believed his father could solve any problem. Victoria, if I'm right about the sabotage, then solving the technical problems won't be enough. Whoever's been creating these system conflicts will just find new ways to cause problems. Then we'll have to identify them and stop them. And if we can't? Victoria's expression hardened with the determination of someone who hadn't climbed to the CEO level by backing down from difficult challenges. Then we'll protect the airline and our passengers by whatever means necessary. For the next 6 hours, Noah immersed himself in the most complex forensic analysis of his career. Using techniques his father had taught him, and knowledge gained through years of aircraft maintenance, he systematically traced every system modification across Mountain Air's fleet. The pattern that emerged was both elegant and disturbing. Someone with intimate knowledge of aircraft systems had been introducing subtle incompatibilities that would create problems months or years after installation. The modifications were technically legal and individually harmless, but when combined across multiple aircraft, they created the systematic failures that had brought Mountain Air to the edge of regulatory shutdown. More importantly, Noah identified the specific maintenance authorizations used for each problematic modification. The pattern pointed to a single individual with high-level access to aircraft systems and detailed knowledge of how to create delayed failures. I know who's been sabotaging your aircraft, Noah told Victoria when she returned to check on his progress. Who? Noah showed her a maintenance authorization log that he'd cross-referenced with the timeline of system modifications. Richard Banning, your Director of Maintenance Operations. He's the only person with sufficient access and technical knowledge to have orchestrated this pattern of sabotage. Victoria stared at the documentation with the expression of someone whose trust had been systematically betrayed. Richard's been with the company for 15 years. He was one of the people I relied on most when I took over as CEO, which would make him the perfect person to undermine your leadership by creating problems that made the airline look incompetent under your management. But why? What would he gain from destroying Mountain Air? Noah had been considering that question throughout his analysis. Maybe he expected to be promoted to a senior position when you were hired. Maybe he has connections with a competitor who wants to acquire Mountain Air's roots. Or maybe he's just bitter about working under a female CEO. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression grew even more troubled. It's Richard. He's asking about the status of our analysis and whether the aircraft will be cleared for operations today. Perfect timing, Noah said grimly. He's probably wondering whether his sabotage has succeeded in destroying the airline. As Victoria prepared to answer the call, Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest with the accumulated weight of decisions that would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but his own understanding of what he was capable of achieving. The technical problems were solved, but the human ones were just beginning. Outside the break room window, Inspector Rodriguez was returning to the hangar for her scheduled review of Noah's analysis. In a few hours, she would decide whether Mountain Air's fleet could return to service based on solutions developed by a former baggage handler working with borrowed expertise and borrowed time. But first, they would have to confront the reality that Mountain Air's problems weren't just technical, they were personal, deliberate, and designed to destroy everything Victoria had been trying to build. The crash report was buried in a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in 20 years, hidden beneath layers of regulatory documents and insurance claims that time had turned into archaeological artifacts. Noah found it by accident while searching for additional maintenance records in Mountain Air's archive room, following a reference number that had appeared in his father's flight logbook. The official accident report was dated March 15, 2003. Test flight of experimental navigation system. Aircraft. F-16D Fighting Falcon. Pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon. Cause. Flight management system failure during high-stress maneuver. Recommendations: enhanced integration testing for new avionics systems. But stapled to the back of the official report was something Noah had never seen before. Preliminary investigation memo marked confidential that had apparently been overlooked when the files were transferred to long-term storage. The memo was signed by Richard Banning. Noah's hands trembled as he read the document that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his father's death. According to Banning's preliminary findings, the flight management system failure hadn't been a random malfunction or integration error. It had been the result of deliberately modified software designed to create failures under specific operational conditions. Sabotage, Noah whispered to the empty archive room. The memo detailed Banning's investigation into suspicious code found in the experimental navigation system code that shouldn't have been present and served no functional purpose except to create timing conflicts during high-stress flight operations. Banning had recommended a full criminal investigation, but according to handwritten notes in the margin, his findings had been dismissed by senior officials who preferred to attribute the crash to pilot error and system complexity. Noah photographed every page of the document with his phone, his mind racing through implications that stretched back 2 decades. If Banning had been investigating sabotage in 2003, then the current problems at Mountain Air weren't Richard's first encounter with deliberately modified aircraft systems. But why would Banning investigate sabotage and then later become a saboteur himself? The contradiction didn't make sense unless... Noah, Victoria's voice echoed through the archive room. Inspector Rodriguez is asking for you. She wants to review your analysis before making her decision about the fleet. Noah carefully replaced the crash report file and walked toward the maintenance hangar with his mind churning through possibilities he hadn't previously considered. If Banning had been investigating aircraft sabotage 20 years ago, then he might have learned techniques that he later used for his own purposes. Or perhaps the sabotage had never stopped, perhaps it had simply evolved and found new targets. Inspector Rodriguez was waiting in the conference room with Frank Morrison and Sarah Chen, surrounded by the comprehensive analysis Noah had prepared over the past 48 hours. His timeline charts, system diagrams, and maintenance correlations covered every available surface, like the aftermath of an academic explosion. "Mr. Calderon, I've reviewed your preliminary findings," Inspector Rodriguez said without preamble. "Your analysis of the fleet problems is impressive, but your conclusions about deliberate sabotage are extremely serious. Do you have evidence to support such allegations?" Noah had been dreading this moment, knowing that accusations of criminal sabotage would require proof that went beyond pattern recognition and technical analysis. But the crash report from his father's accident had provided exactly the evidence he needed. "Yes, ma'am, I do." Noah pulled out his phone and displayed the photographs of Banning's 2003 investigation memo. This document shows that Richard Banning was investigating aircraft sabotage 20 years ago. The techniques described in his findings are identical to the methods used to create Mountain Air's current system conflicts. Inspector Rodriguez studied the photos with growing alarm. "Where did you find this document?" "In Mountain Air's archives, attached to the accident report for my father's crash in 2003. "Your father was the pilot killed in that test flight?" "Yes, ma'am. And according to Banning's investigation, the crash was caused by deliberately modified flight management software, the same type of sabotage affecting Mountain Air's fleet today." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Frank Morrison looked like a man who'd discovered that his trusted colleague was a criminal. Sarah Chen was staring at the maintenance records with new understanding of patterns she'd previously attributed to bad luck. "This changes everything," Inspector Rodriguez said finally. "If Mr. Banning has been systematically sabotaging aircraft systems for 2 decades, then we're dealing with a criminal conspiracy that threatens aviation safety on a much broader scale." Victoria's phone rang, interrupting the tense discussion. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression grew even more troubled. "It's Richard again. He says he needs to speak with me immediately about urgent safety concerns." "Don't answer it," Noah said quickly. "If he knows we've discovered his sabotage, he might escalate to more direct action." "What kind of direct action?" Noah thought about the sophisticated knowledge required to modify flight management systems without detection. Someone with Banning's expertise could potentially take control of aircraft systems remotely. If he has access to Mountain Air's computer networks, he might be able to interfere with flight operations in real time. Inspector Rodriguez stood abruptly. "I'm grounding your entire fleet immediately. If there's any possibility of remote interference with aircraft systems, I cannot allow continued operations." "Wait," Victoria said. "If we ground the fleet now, Richard will know we've discovered his sabotage. He'll have time to destroy evidence and potentially target other airlines." "Miss Hale, I cannot prioritize criminal investigation over immediate safety concerns." Noah looked around the room at faces reflecting various degrees of fear, anger, and determination. The technical solutions he'd developed were sound, but they wouldn't protect against sabotage that could be activated remotely. On the other hand, grounding the fleet would alert Banning to their investigation and give him opportunity to escape prosecution. "There might be a third option," Noah said slowly. "Explain." "We implement my technical solutions but add additional security protocols that would prevent remote interference. If Banning tries to sabotage aircraft systems during flight operations, we'll detect it immediately and have evidence for criminal prosecution." "That's an enormous risk," Inspector Rodriguez pointed out. The FBI Command Center was established in a conference room at Denver International Airport that had been hastily converted into a secure operations facility. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of cybercrime investigations, coordinated with Inspector Rodriguez and a team of federal analysts who had arrived on a red-eye flight from Washington. Noah found himself at the center of an investigation that had expanded far beyond Mountain Air's technical problems to encompass a potential terrorist attack on the nation's aviation infrastructure. The hand-drawn airplane schematic that Mateo had created for his science project sat on the conference table alongside FBI case files and classified intelligence reports, representing the intersection of a child's innocent dreams and the complex realities of aviation security. "Tell me about the sabotage techniques," Agent Martinez said, reviewing Noah's analysis of the fleet problems. "How sophisticated would someone need to be to implement these attacks?" "Extremely sophisticated," Noah replied. "They'd need deep knowledge of aircraft systems, architecture, access to software development tools, and the ability to penetrate airline computer networks without detection. We're talking about someone with both technical expertise and significant resources. How many people have that level of capability?" Noah considered the question carefully. "In the commercial aviation industry, maybe a few dozen worldwide, but if you include military contractors and government agencies, the number could be higher." Agent Martinez turned to Richard Banning, who had arrived under FBI protection after 20 years of covert investigation. "Mr. Banning, you've been tracking this conspiracy since 2003. What can you tell us about the perpetrator's identity?" Banning looked exhausted but determined, carrying himself with the weight of someone who had spent decades pursuing an enemy that remained always just beyond reach. "I believe we're dealing with someone inside the aviation software industry, someone with legitimate access to multiple airline systems who's been using that access to test attack methods." "Any specific suspects?" Dr. Marcus Webb, former military contractor who now heads software development for global aviation systems. His company provides flight management software to over a dozen major airlines, including Transglobal. Agent Martinez made notes. "What's his motive?" "Unknown, but his company has been pushing airlines to adopt new software systems that would centralize control of multiple aircraft types. If he could demonstrate that current systems are vulnerable to attack, airlines might be more willing to adopt his centralized platform." Noah felt a chill of recognition. A centralized platform would give him unprecedented access to control multiple airlines simultaneously. Instead of attacking individual aircraft, he could potentially ground entire fleets with a single command, or cause coordinated crashes during peak travel periods, Inspector Rodriguez added grimly. The implications were staggering. If Webb's plan succeeded, the resulting chaos would destroy public confidence in aviation safety and position his company as the only solution to prevent future attacks. It was corporate terrorism on a scale that could reshape the entire industry. "What's our timeline?" Noah asked. Agent Martinez consulted her secure tablet. "Transglobal's New Year's Eve operations begin in 4 days. They're planning to operate over 300 flights that evening, carrying approximately 100 passengers. If Webb launches his attack during those operations, we could be looking at casualties in the hundreds or thousands." Noah thought about Mateo's airplane schematic, drawn with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who dreamed of flight without understanding the complex vulnerabilities that made modern aviation possible. "What's our strategy to stop him?" "We need proof of Webb's intentions before we can arrest him," Agent Martinez replied. "Right now, we have circumstantial evidence and 20 years of suspicions, but nothing that would hold up in court." "What about the evidence from Mountain Air's systems?" "It shows systematic sabotage, but we can't definitively prove Webb was responsible. He's too smart to leave obvious fingerprints." Banning leaned forward. "There might be another approach. Webb thinks I'm just a maintenance director who's been helping him test attack methods. If I can get him to reveal his plans for the Transglobal attack, we'd have the evidence we need." "That's extremely dangerous," Agent Martinez pointed out. "If Webb realizes you've been investigating him, he could accelerate his timeline or target you directly. It's also our best chance to prevent the attack and protect innocent passengers." Noah looked around the command center at faces, reflecting various degrees of determination, fear, and professional calculation. The technical challenges of preventing aircraft sabotage were complex enough, but the human elements, trust, deception, and the willingness to risk everything for the greater good added layers of complexity that no engineering manual could address. "I want to help," Noah said. Agent Martinez shook her head. "Mr. Calderon, you've already provided invaluable assistance with the technical analysis. But the operational phase of this investigation requires federal law enforcement expertise. Webb doesn't know who I am. To him, I'm just a baggage handler who got lucky diagnosing some technical problems. I could approach him as someone interested in aviation security, maybe offering to share information about vulnerabilities I've discovered." "Absolutely not. The risk is too high." Victoria, who had been quietly observing the federal coordination, spoke up. "Agent Martinez, Noah understands these systems better than anyone else on your team. If Webb tries to implement real-time sabotage during the operation, you'll need someone who can counter his attacks immediately. We have technical specialists. Do you have anyone who can diagnose and resolve complex avionics problems in real time while Webb is actively trying to crash aircraft?" Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent her career making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Because that's what we're talking about. This won't be a theoretical exercise, it will be a live technical battle with passenger lives hanging in the balance." Agent Martinez was quiet for several minutes, weighing operational security against practical necessity. "Mr. Calderon, if we allow your participation, it would be under strict federal oversight with predetermined safety protocols." "Understood. And you'd be working with a full FBI technical support team, not operating independently." "Of course. Your son would need to be placed in protective custody during the operation." Noah felt his chest tighten. "Is that really necessary? If Webb realizes you're working against him, he might target your family to force your cooperation. We can't take that risk." Noah thought about Mateo, probably still sleeping in the employee break room, trusting that his father would solve whatever technical problems the adults were discussing. The boy had already sacrificed so much for Noah's choices-missed school events, evenings spent at the airport, the uncertainty of constantly changing plans. Now Noah was considering placing him in federal protection while pursuing a terrorist who had killed his grandfather. "There's something else you should know," Agent Martinez continued. "Dr. Webb has requested a meeting with you." The words hit the room like a physical blow. "What?" "He called Mountain Air this morning, claiming he heard about your technical work and wants to discuss potential collaboration on aviation security research. It could be coincidence, but—" "It's not coincidence," Banning said grimly. "He's trying to determine how much we know about his activities. If Noah has indeed identified the sabotage techniques, Webb needs to assess whether he represents a threat." Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest as he considered the implications. Webb's request for a meeting suggested that Noah's analysis had been more accurate than he'd realized accurate enough to draw the attention of a terrorist who had been operating undetected for 20 years. "When does he want to meet?" Noah asked. "Tomorrow afternoon. He's flying into Denver specifically for the conversation. Then that's our opportunity to gather evidence and prevent the transglobal attack." Agent Martinez studied Noah with the appraising look of someone evaluating a critical operational decision. "Mr. Calderon, are you absolutely certain you want to participate in this operation? Because once you're involved, there won't be any way to protect you if things go wrong." Noah looked at Mateo's airplane schematic, thinking about the innocent enthusiasm that had created those careful drawings of flight systems and engine components. His son believed that airplanes were magical machines that connected families and enabled dreams. Noah had the opportunity to ensure that belief remained unspoiled by the reality of terrorism and sabotage. "I'm certain," he said. "My father died investigating this conspiracy. I'm not going to let Dr. Webb kill hundreds of innocent people to complete whatever he started 20 years ago." Agent Martinez nodded slowly. "Then we'll set up the meeting and prepare for whatever Webb is planning. But Mr. Calderon, I want you to understand that this operation will require everything you know about aircraft systems and more courage than any technical manual can teach. As the command center prepared for the next phase of the investigation, Noah called Elena to arrange protective custody for Matteo. The conversation was brief and emotional, Elena understanding immediately that her ex-husband was pursuing something dangerous but necessary, something that connected to the grief and determination that had shaped their son's entire life. "Be careful," she said before hanging up. "Matteo needs his father to come home." "I will," Noah promised. "And when this is over, maybe we can finally tell him the truth about why his grandfather died." Outside the conference room, snow continued to fall on the Colorado landscape, covering the airport in a pristine layer of white that made the complex machinery of aviation look deceptively peaceful. Tomorrow, Noah would meet with a terrorist who had killed his father and threatened thousands of innocent passengers. The technical challenges he'd mastered over the past week would be tested in a confrontation that would determine not just Mountain Air's future, but the safety of the entire aviation industry. The hand-drawn airplane schematic seemed to pulse with childish optimism and adult responsibility. Soon Noah would discover whether his expertise was sufficient to protect the dreams that drawing represented, or whether Dr. Webb's conspiracy would shatter those dreams forever. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at Denver International Airport precisely on schedule, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to controlling complex systems and the people who operated them. Noah watched from the FBI surveillance station as Webb made his way through the Terminala man in his early 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes that suggested success in the specialized world of aviation technology. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Mountain Air's executive conference room, which had been equipped with recording devices and monitored by federal agents positioned throughout the airport. Noah wore a nearly invisible wire and carried a modified tablet that would allow him to demonstrate technical concepts while covertly transmitting information to the FBI command center. "Remember," Agent Martinez said through his earpiece, "your objective is to get Webb to reveal his plans for the transglobal attack. Let him think you're impressed by his technical sophistication and potentially willing to collaborate." Noah nodded, feeling the familiar weight of his father's challenge coin pressed against his chest. The airline's master control system terminal glowed quietly in the adjacent room, the same type of system that Webb had been penetrating for years to test his sabotage techniques. Victoria introduced Noah to Webb with carefully scripted words that portrayed him as a talented technician who had recently discovered vulnerabilities in aircraft systems. Webb's handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but his eyes held the calculating attention of someone who recognized a potential threat. "Mr. Calderon, I've heard impressive things about your work resolving Mountain Air's technical problems," Webb said, settling into his chair with easy confidence. "Victoria tells me you identified systematic issues that had stumped certified maintenance teams for months." "I got lucky," Noah replied, following the script Agent Martinez had prepared. "I happened to recognize patterns that reminded me of problems I'd seen in military systems." "Ah, yes, your Air Force background. Avionics specialist, if I remember correctly." The fact that Webb had researched Noah's background so thoroughly was both encouraging and alarming. It suggested serious interest in Noah's capabilities, but also implied that Webb viewed him as a potential threat worth investigating. "That's right. I worked primarily on fighter aircraft, but the fundamental system architectures are similar across military and commercial platforms." Webb leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to one of professional interest. "And you believe those similarities extend to vulnerability patterns as well?" "Absolutely. In fact, I think commercial aviation is more vulnerable than military systems because there's less emphasis on security and more focus on cost efficiency." "An astute observation. Tell me, have you considered how those vulnerabilities might be exploited by someone with malicious intent?" Noah felt his pulse accelerate. Webb was probing to determine how much Noah understood about the sabotage techniques, but the conversation was moving into dangerous territory faster than Agent Martinez had anticipated. "I've thought about it," Noah replied carefully. "The interconnected nature of modern aircraft systems means that compromising one component could create cascade failures across multiple systems. Webb's smile widened. Precisely. And if someone had access to the software that manages those interconnections, say, through legitimate business relationships with multiple airlines, they could potentially coordinate failures across entire fleets. That would require incredibly sophisticated knowledge and access. Indeed, but the results would be proportionally significant. Webb pulled out his own tablet and displayed a complex diagram showing airline network architectures. Consider Trans-Global Airlines, for example. They operate over 300 flights on New Year's Eve, all managed through centralized computer systems that my company helped design. Noah's chest tightened as Webb openly discussed the target that federal investigators had identified. That's an enormous responsibility. It's also an enormous opportunity. Imagine if someone could demonstrate that those centralized systems were vulnerable to coordinated attack. Airlines would be forced to adopt new security protocols, probably including even more centralized management systems to ensure consistent protection. You mean someone could create a problem in order to sell the solution? Webb's expression grew more serious. Mr. Calderon, the aviation industry is remarkably resistant to change. Airlines prefer to minimize costs rather than invest in security improvements, even when those improvements could save thousands of lives. Sometimes dramatic demonstrations are necessary to motivate appropriate action. Through his earpiece, Noah heard Agent Martinez's voice. He's confessing to planned terrorism. Keep him talking about specific details. What kind of dramatic demonstrations? Noah asked. Webb studied him for a long moment, his calculating gaze suggesting internal debate about how much to reveal. Hypothetically, if someone could coordinate system failures across multiple aircraft during peak travel periods, the resulting chaos would force immediate industry-wide security improvements. Hypothetically, that could also kill hundreds of innocent people. Short-term casualties to prevent long-term systemic failures. Webb replied with chilling calm. The aviation industry operates thousands of flights daily with inadequate security. A coordinated demonstration of vulnerability would save far more lives than it cost. Noah felt sick listening to Webb's rationalization of mass murder disguised as public service. When would such a hypothetical demonstration occur? New Year's Eve would be optimal. Maximum passenger load, maximum media attention, maximum impact on industry decision-making. Webb leaned back in his chair, watching Noah's reaction carefully. Of course, implementing such a demonstration would require exceptional technical expertise and someone with intimate knowledge of airline security vulnerabilities. Someone like you? Webb's smile was arctic. Someone like us, potentially. Your analysis of Mountain Air's systems was remarkably sophisticated, Mr. Calderon. With proper guidance, you could help develop security solutions that would protect the entire industry. The offer hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Webb was recruiting Noah to participate in the terrorist attack, believing that Noah's technical skills would be valuable for implementing the sabotage or developing the security systems that would follow. That's an interesting proposition, Noah said, fighting to keep his voice steady. What would such collaboration involve? Access to cutting-edge aviation security research. Opportunities to work on projects that could reshape how airlines protect their passengers. Financial compensation commensurate with the value of your contributions. Webb pulled out a contract that looked professionally prepared, complete with legal language and compensation figures that made Noah's eyes widen. The document was real, suggesting that Webb had been planning this recruitment for some time. "This is a formal offer?" Noah asked. "Contingent on successful completion of a demonstration project. Consider it a test of your technical capabilities and your commitment to improving aviation security." Through his earpiece, Agent Martinez was coordinating with other federal agents. "We have enough for arrests. Move in on my signal." But Noah realized they needed more specific information about the trans-global attack to prevent it effectively. What would the demonstration project involve? Webb's expression grew cautious. Nothing illegal, of course, simply a technical analysis of TransGlobal's system vulnerabilities, followed by recommendations for security improvements. And if those vulnerabilities were significant enough to warrant immediate action, then appropriate authorities would be notified through proper channels. Noah understood that Webb was speaking in code, describing the terrorist attack in language that could be interpreted as legitimate security research. The FBI recordings would capture Webb's intentions, but they might not provide enough technical detail to prevent the actual implementation. Dr. Webb, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand exactly what you're planning before I can commit to participating. Webb's smile faded, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who had recognized a threat. Mr. Calderon, I think you already understand more than you're admitting. The air in the conference room suddenly felt charged with danger. Webb's demeanor had shifted from recruitment to suspicion, and Noah realized that his questions had revealed too much about federal law enforcement interest in the conspiracy. I understand that you're offering me an opportunity to use my technical skills to improve aviation security, Noah replied, trying to maintain the pretense of innocent interest. I understand that you're wearing a recording device and working with federal agents to gather evidence about activities you don't fully comprehend. The pretense collapsed like a house of cards. Webb stood slowly, his expression shifting to one of cold fury, tempered by professional calculation. Agent Martinez, we're blown, Noah said into his microphone. Move in now. Webb pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Too late, Mr. Calderon. The TransGlobal demonstration has been moved up. It begins in 30 minutes. The FBI tactical team burst through the conference room doors 30 seconds too late. Webb had already sent the activation signal to his sabotage systems, and TransGlobal's afternoon flights were beginning to experience the first symptoms of coordinated system failures. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with reports from air traffic control centers across the country as aircraft started showing navigation anomalies, communication dropouts, and flight management system errors. 6 aircraft reporting problems so far, Agent Martinez announced, coordinating federal response from her command center. TransGlobal 447 en route to Los Angeles, TransGlobal 623 departing Miami, 4 others showing initial symptoms. Webb sat calmly in federal custody, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose carefully planned operation was proceeding as intended. You can arrest me, Agent Martinez, but you can't stop what I've already set in motion. Those aircraft are flying with compromised systems that will fail progressively over the next 2 hours. Noah felt the weight of hundreds of lives pressing against his chest like a physical burden. The official FAA certification document with his signature lay on the conference table, tangible proof that he now had the authority to address aircraft system problems, but also the responsibility for whatever happened next. How do we stop it? Agent Martinez demanded. Webb's smile was arctic. You don't. The sabotage is embedded in the aircraft's core systems and activated by altitude and time triggers. Even if you could identify every affected aircraft, you can't modify their software while they're in flight. Then we ground the entire TransGlobal fleet, Inspector Rodriguez said, reaching for her emergency communication device. Too late for that as well, Webb replied. The aircraft showing symptoms are already airborne with passengers. If you force them to land immediately with compromised navigation systems, you'll cause exactly the kind of catastrophic failures I've been trying to demonstrate. Noah studied the technical readouts on his tablet, his mind racing through the system architectures he'd analyzed during his investigation of Mountain Air's problems. Webb, you said the sabotage is triggered by altitude and time parameters. That means it's following a predictable sequence. Very predictable. Each aircraft will experience progressive system failures designed to overwhelm pilot capability and air traffic control resources. The result will be controlled chaos that demonstrates the vulnerability of current aviation systems. Controlled chaos that kills innocent people, Victoria said with barely contained rage. Webb's expression remained coldly professional. Acceptable casualties to prevent larger systemic failures. The aviation industry has ignored security vulnerabilities for decades. Sometimes dramatic demonstrations are necessary to motivate appropriate action. Agent Martinez was coordinating with air traffic control centers, while FBI technical specialists established connections to Transglobal's operations center. Mr. Calderon, we need options. Can you analyze the sabotage techniques and develop countermeasures? Noah was already working through the problem, applying everything he'd learned about aircraft systems and Webb's attack methods. The sabotage has to be implemented through software that's already present on the aircraft. Webb couldn't install hardware modifications on every plane in Transglobal's fleet. Meaning the attack is probably using legitimate system functions in illegitimate ways. If I can understand the specific trigger mechanisms, I might be able to develop override procedures that pilots can implement manually. Webb laughed coldly. Mr. Calderon, you're thinking like an engineer when you should be thinking like a systems architect. I didn't modify individual aircraft. I modified the centralized software that manages fleet-wide operations. Every aircraft receives continuous updates from Transglobal's operations center, including navigation data, weather information, and flight management parameters. The implications hit Noah like a physical blow. You've been poisoning the data streams that all Transglobal aircraft depend on for safe flight operations. Precisely. And because the poisoned data looks legitimate to aircraft systems, the pilots have no way to distinguish between accurate information and malicious inputs. Agent Martinez was receiving increasingly urgent reports from air traffic control. 12 aircraft now showing problems, 2 have declared emergencies and are requesting immediate landing clearance. Noah closed his eyes and visualized the system architecture that Webb had described. Centralized operations meant that all Transglobal aircraft were receiving contaminated data from a single source. But that also meant there was a single point of failure that could be addressed if he could gain access to Transglobal's operations systems. I need direct access to Transglobal's flight operations center, Noah said. If I can isolate the contaminated data streams and replace them with clean information, the aircraft should be able to complete their flights safely. Transglobal's operations center is in Atlanta, Agent Martinez replied. Even with federal authorization, it would take hours to get you there and provide system access. Then we bring their systems here. Noah was already formulating a plan that would require everything he'd learned about aircraft systems and network architecture. Transglobal's operations center manages aircraft through satellite communication links. If we can replicate those links from here and override the contaminated data streams, we can essentially hijack Webb's attack and turn it into a rescue operation. Webb's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern. That's impossible. You don't have access to Transglobal's communication protocols or encryption keys. But you do, Noah replied, understanding the opportunity that Webb's presence provided. And we have federal authority to compel your cooperation in preventing mass casualties. Agent Martinez understood immediately. Dr. Webb, you have 2 choices. Provide the technical information needed to stop your attack, or face federal terrorism charges that will put you in prison for the rest of your life. I'll face those charges regardless, Webb pointed out. Why would I help you prevent the demonstration that I've spent years planning? Noah looked at the FAA certification document bearing his signature and felt his father's challenge coin pressing against his chest. Because if those aircraft crash, you'll be responsible for mass murder, not a security demonstration. And because even terrorists sometimes have limits on how many innocent people they're willing to kill. For the first time since his arrest, Webb's professional composure cracked slightly. You don't understand the stakes involved. The aviation industry's security vulnerabilities represent a threat to national security that far exceeds the casualties from a single demonstration. Then help us fix those vulnerabilities without killing passengers, Victoria said. Provide the information Noah needs to stop the attack, and we'll work with you to address the systemic problems you've identified. Webb was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options while Agent Martinez coordinated increasingly urgent federal response efforts. How many aircraft are affected now? 18 and climbing, Agent Martinez replied. If this continues, we could be looking at multiple catastrophic failures within the next hour. Webb's calculation was visible on his face, the conflict between his commitment to demonstrating aviation vulnerabilities and his unwillingness to be responsible for hundreds of deaths. Mr. Calderon, if I provide the access codes and technical specifications, can you actually implement countermeasures quickly enough to prevent crashes? I can try, but I'll need complete cooperation and accurate information. Webb nodded slowly. Agent Martinez, I want immunity from terrorism charges in exchange for my cooperation in preventing casualties. Absolutely not, but I can recommend consideration for cooperation during sentencing. Then you'd better hope Mr. Calderon is as good as he thinks he is. For the next hour, Noah worked with intensity that pushed his technical skills to their absolute limits. Using Webb's access codes and system specifications, he established connections to TransGlobal's operations center and began the complex process of identifying and replacing contaminated data streams while the affected aircraft continued flying with progressively failing systems. The work required simultaneous analysis of multiple aircraft systems, real-time coordination with pilots and air traffic controllers, and the kind of intuitive understanding of aviation technology that Noah had inherited from his father and developed through years of hands-on experience. TransGlobal 447 is reporting navigation system failure, Agent Martinez announced. They're flying manually with limited instrument guidance. I've isolated their data stream, Noah replied, his fingers moving rapidly across multiple keyboards and tablets. Uploading clean navigation data now. TransGlobal 623 has lost communication with air traffic control. Switching their communication protocols to backup frequencies, they should be back online in 30 seconds. Aircraft by aircraft, system by system, Noah worked to counter Webb's sabotage while hundreds of passengers flew unknowingly through the most sophisticated terrorist attack in aviation history. The technical challenges were immense, but the human stakes drove him to find solutions that no training manual had ever contemplated. By 6 p.m., all 18 affected aircraft had landed safely at their destinations or alternate airports, their passengers unaware that they had survived an attack that could have killed thousands. Webb's demonstration had been neutralized, but the broader implications of his conspiracy would reshape aviation security for decades to come. As Noah finally leaned back in his chair, exhausted but successful, Agent Martinez approached with news that would complete his transformation from baggage handler to aviation security expert. Mr. Calderon, the FAA wants to discuss a permanent position coordinating cybersecurity for the aviation industry. Interested? Noah looked at the certification document bearing his signature and felt his father's legacy settling around him like a mantle. Very interested. But first, I need to call my son and tell him that his grandfather would be proud. 3 months later, Noah stood in the executive wing of Mountain Air's headquarters, studying the view from his new office window as aircraft moved through their carefully choreographed dance of departure and arrival. His official employee ID badge identified him as Chief Technical Officer, but the title felt less important than the knowledge that every aircraft he could see was flying with security protocols he'd helped design. The transformation had been remarkably swift. Within weeks of preventing Webb's terrorist attack, Noah found himself at the center of a federal initiative to modernize aviation cybersecurity. The FAA had fast-tracked his certifications, the Department of Homeland Security had recruited him as a consultant, and multiple airlines were implementing security improvements based on his analysis of system vulnerabilities. But the most significant change was personal. For the first time in 12 years, Noah woke up each morning eager to tackle challenges that made full use of his technical abilities while serving a purpose larger than individual advancement. Dad, are you ready? Mateo appeared in the office doorway, wearing the kind of smile that had become frequent since Noah's career transformation. At 11 years old, the boy had gained confidence and pride that came from seeing his father recognized for talents that had long been hidden. Ready for what? Noah asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Mom's here for the ceremony, Elena stood in the reception area, wearing a dress that Noah hadn't seen since their wedding day, her expression reflecting a mixture of pride and vindication that spoke to years of believing in potential that Noah had nearly abandoned. She greeted him with a warmth that had been absent from their relationship for the better part of a decade. "Congratulations," she said simply. "I always knew you'd find your way back to this." The ceremony was being held in Mountainair's main hangar, where a small crowd had gathered to witness Noah's formal recognition by the Aviation Security Foundation for his role in preventing the transglobal attack. Inspector Rodriguez was present, along with Agent Martinez, Victoria Hale, and Richard Banning, who had been cleared of all suspicions and promoted to Director of Aviation Security. But the most meaningful presence was the empty chair in the front row, marked with a small placard bearing Miguel Calderon's name and military rank. Noah's father couldn't witness his son's achievement, but his influence was evident in every aspect of Noah's approach to aviation, security, and technical problem-solving. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Foundation's director announced, "we gather today to recognize extraordinary service in protecting aviation safety and preventing terrorist attacks on the national transportation infrastructure." As Noah walked to the podium to accept the award, he felt his father's challenge coin pressing against his chest with familiar weight. But the sensation was different now, not the burden of unfulfilled potential, but the satisfaction of abilities finally directed toward their intended purpose. "This recognition belongs to everyone who contributed to identifying and stopping Dr. Webb's conspiracy," Noah said, addressing the small audience. "But I want to particularly acknowledge Lieutenant Colonel Miguel Calderon, whose investigation 20 years ago provided the foundation for understanding how aviation systems could be compromised by those with malicious intent." Noah pulled the challenge coin from his pocket and held it up for the audience to see. "My father taught me that understanding machines means understanding their language, or not just the official specifications, but the subtle patterns that reveal their true condition. Today, that lesson helps protect thousands of passengers who will never know how close they came to being victims of sophisticated terrorism." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and equipment was packed away, Noah found himself alone in the hangar with Mateo. The boy was studying an aircraft engine with the focused attention he'd inherited from his father, asking questions about turbofan mechanics and fuel injection systems. "Will you teach me about airplanes?" Mateo asked. "Like Grandpa taught you?" Noah smiled, remembering afternoons spent in Miguel's garage, learning to diagnose problems by sound and feel rather than by manuals. "I'd like that. But first, let me tell you about your grandfather's real job." They sat on folding chairs beside the aircraft, and Noah began the story he'd never been able to share before: Miguel's work as a test pilot, his investigation of aviation security vulnerabilities, and his death in service of protecting other aviators from system failures that could have killed hundreds of people. "He was a hero," Mateo said when the story was complete. "He was a man who used his abilities to protect people who couldn't protect themselves," Noah replied. "That's what heroes do. They serve purposes larger than their own advancement." "Is that what you're doing now?" Noah looked around the hangar at the complex machinery that represented humanity's conquest of gravity and distance. "I'm trying to follow his example. Use what I know to keep people safe, solve problems that matter, and maybe inspire the next generation to do the same." Mateo was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of family legacy and personal responsibility. "Will you teach me to be like him?" "I'll teach you to be like yourself," Noah replied, "but with the same commitment to using your talents in service of something bigger than personal achievement." As they prepared to leave the hangar, Victoria approached with news that would shape the next phase of Noah's career. "The FAA wants to establish a new aviation cybersecurity division. They're offering you the position of director, reporting directly to the administrator. That's a significant responsibility. It's also an opportunity to prevent future attacks, like Webb's conspiracy. Your analysis revealed vulnerabilities that affect the entire industry. Someone needs to coordinate systematic improvements across all airlines." Noah looked at his new employee ID badge, thinking about the journey from baggage handler to chief technical officer to potential federal executive. What would it involve? Oversight of cybersecurity protocols for all commercial aviation operations, development of new standards for system integration and vulnerability assessment, coordination with law enforcement agencies on aviation terrorism prevention, and travel requirements? Victoria smiled, understanding the concern. Primarily based in Denver, with occasional trips to Washington for congressional briefings and industry conferences. Nothing that would disrupt your family life. Noah felt the challenge coin press against his chest one final time, carrying the accumulated weight of his father's sacrifice and his own journey from hidden expertise to recognized achievement. I'm interested. When would it start? July 1st. 3 months to wrap up your responsibilities here and prepare for the transition. As Noah drove home with Mateo that evening, the familiar landscape of Denver stretched before them under an early spring sky that promised longer days and warmer weather. The boy chattered about the ceremony and the aircraft they'd examined, his enthusiasm reflecting the confidence that came from understanding his place in a larger story of service and sacrifice. "Dad," Mateo said as they pulled into their driveway, "I'm proud of you." The words hit Noah with unexpected emotion. For 12 years, he'd measured his success as a father by Mateo's happiness and security, but he'd never considered whether the boy might be proud of his achievements. The possibility that his son could respect him not just as a provider, but as a professional felt like a gift he hadn't expected. "I'm proud of you too, Mijo, for being patient with all the changes, for supporting me when things were uncertain, and for reminding me that some things are more important than playing it safe." That night, as Noah helped Mateo with homework that now included aviation science projects inspired by their shared interest in flight, he reflected on the distance he'd traveled from the baggage handler who'd watched aircraft with hidden longing to the cybersecurity expert who was helping protect aviation's future. The challenge coin sat on his dresser beside Mateo's hand-drawn airplane schematic, symbols of past sacrifice and future possibility that would continue guiding his choices in the years to come. Outside his window, aircraft moved through the night sky with lights that looked like moving stars, carrying passengers who trusted their safety to systems that Noah now helped protect. Sometimes the people who've sacrificed the most are indeed the ones with the most to give. But giving requires the courage to risk everything safe and predictable for the chance to serve something larger than personal security. Noah had finally found that courage, and in finding it, had discovered that the most grounded people are often the ones who help everyone else soar.